Every world that has ever captured the imagination of millions carries within it a hidden layer, a quiet archive of things almost known, but never quite surfaced into the light of common understanding. The world of Pokémon is no different from any other world in this regard, except perhaps in the sheer depth of the archive it conceals beneath its familiar colors and gentle melodies. And before you drift off, consider subscribing for more calming journeys like this. And thank you for helping us gently approach 2,000 subscribers tonight. What follows is an unhurried journey through 99 of those concealed truths, offered one at a time in the soft and steady rhythm of something worth lingering over. The first thing worth understanding is that this world was designed with far more care than most people ever realize. Every detail that seems incidental, every name that sounds almost random, every number that appears to be a simple placeholder carries within it a deliberate intention placed there by someone who understood exactly what they were building. That understanding deepens every fact that comes after it. There is also something particular about the way these facts settle when encountered slowly, when allowed to arrive without hurry and without pressure. Each one opens a small window into a different corner of a place that has existed across decades, across continents, across generations of players who each found something different to love within the same shared world. There is a naming tradition running through every game in this series that most players simply take for granted without ever thinking too carefully about where it comes from. Every professor who has ever appeared in a main series Pokemon game carries the name of a tree species: Professor Oak, Professor Elm, Professor Birch, Professor Rowan, Professor Juniper, Professor Sycamore, Professor Kukui, Professor Magnolia, Professor Willow, Professor Sada, Professor Turo. Each name traces back to a real and specific genus of tree somewhere in the botanical record of the world. What makes this detail remarkable is not the tradition itself, but the scope of possibility it opens up when followed to its conclusion. There are somewhere in the range of 60,000 recognized and formally documented tree species on this planet. That number, when placed beside the long-running tradition of professor naming, means that the creative well for future professors is essentially inexhaustible. Theoretically, there could be a Professor Dragonblood, named after the striking red-sapped Drakena Draco of the Canary Islands. There could be a Professor Monkey Puzzle, named after the ancient and distinctive Araucaria araucana of the Chilean highlands. Both of those trees are real. Both of those names would satisfy the tradition entirely. The simple fact that a naming convention introduced in the earliest days of the series remains capable of generating tens of thousands of future possibilities says something quiet but important about how this world was originally conceived. It was conceived with room to grow, with structures built loosely enough that they could expand across decades without breaking. That expansiveness is not accidental. It speaks to a kind of patient design philosophy that treats the long view seriously, that asks not just what works now, but what could still be working 30 years from now. The professor naming tradition is one of the smallest but clearest windows into that philosophy, a detail so minor that it never demands attention, but so sturdy that it has outlasted entire gaming generations without showing any sign of strain. Long before Pokémon became the phenomenon that filled school hallways and trading card sleeves around the world, there was a demonstration that played at a single gaming convention in Japan in the autumn of 1997. It was called the Space World Demo for the then upcoming Gold and Silver games, and it contained something that would not be fully understood until decades later. It contained the very first appearance of what would eventually be called shiny Pokémon, those alternate colored variants that carry the same stats and abilities as their standard counterparts, but wear a different coat of color, marked by a shower of sparkling stars when they appear in battle. In that 1997 demonstration, nearly every Pokemon in the game had a different alternate coloration assigned to it. These were not the shiny forms that would be standardized in the final release of Gold and Silver. They were earlier experiments, wilder, and in some cases more striking than anything that survived into the finished game. Some of the colorations from that demo for creatures like Charizard, Alakazam, Dragonite, and Porygon were widely considered by those who eventually saw them to be among the most visually compelling alternate forms ever designed for any creature in the series. It is one of those quiet historical details that has a way of reshaping how you think about the things you already know. The shiny Pokemon system, which eventually became one of the most beloved and obsessively hunted features in the entire franchise, began as an unnamed and uncelebrated technical experiment shown to a crowd of people who mostly had no idea what they were looking at. The shimmer existed before the word for it. The rarity existed before the framework that gave it meaning, and it arrived at a gaming convention in Japan before most of the world had even heard of the games that would eventually carry it. There are layers of planning in Pokemon games that never become visible to the player unless something specific is noticed and followed to its source. One such layer sits beneath the surface of the story told in Pokemon Black and White, in the shadow of a villain who presents himself as a man of profound conviction and carefully calculated ambition. Ghetsis is one of the few antagonists in the entire series whose scheming extends far enough that even his own battle team carries evidence of it. His Hydreigon, the fearsome dark and dragon type that anchors his team, possesses a moveset that contains a super effective option against every single Pokemon that his foster son N uses in his own climactic battle. This is not a coincidence of team building. It reads as a deliberate narrative choice embedded in the game's data, a silent confirmation that Ghetsis always had a contingency. If N had refused his orders, if the young king had turned back towards something closer to genuine compassion rather than the ideology he had been shaped to carry, Ghetsis had already prepared the means to overcome him. The battle team was not just a challenge for the player. It was, in the language of the game's internal logic and insurance policy, that kind of detail, hidden entirely within something as mechanical and invisible as a villain's moveset, reflects how carefully the designers of these games sometimes align their storytelling with their systems. The narrative and the gameplay speak the same sentence in this instance, but only one of them is ever written down anywhere that a player would ordinarily look. The other one requires the right question to be asked before it becomes visible. Most players never ask it, but the answer was always there, waiting in the data, like a note left between the lines of a letter that was never meant to be read. In the earliest planning stages of what would become the Pokemon franchise, the creatures at the center of the concept did not have elemental types. The idea that would eventually define the entire strategic backbone of the games, the intricate web of type advantages and disadvantages that shapes every battle ever played, was not part of the original vision. The Pokemon existed first as creatures, pure and undefined by elemental classification, collected and battled for their own sake, without the layered logic that types would eventually bring to every encounter. When the concept of types was introduced later in development, the team had to return to early designs and add visual indicators to communicate the newly assigned classifications. Charmander received the flame at the tip of its tail as a signal of its fire-type nature, a detail that became so iconic that most players assume it was always there, always meant to be, always central to the character's identity. Venusaur received the flowering plant growth upon its back as a signal of its grass typing, another detail that became so deeply associated with the creature that imagining it without that feature feels almost impossible. The retroactive quality of these additions is worth sitting with for a moment. Some of the most defining visual features of the most iconic Pokémon in the history of the franchise were not part of the original design intent. They were solutions to a problem that was identified only after the creatures already existed in some form. The flame on Charmander's tail did not create the fire type Pokémon. The fire type classification created the need for the flame, and the flame arrived to meet that need. The icon and the concept came in the wrong order, and yet the result feels so complete and inevitable that the history behind it is nearly invisible from the finished product. Language in Pokemon games has always carried more weight than it immediately appears to. A small girl in the original games who gives the player a technical machine for the move. Rock Slide describes that move's secondary effect, using a word that did not yet correspond to any actual in game mechanic. She says it can spook the target. What she was describing, in a game that had not yet implemented the relevant system, was the flinch mechanic. Flinching, the brief interruption of a Pokemon's action caused by taking a hit, would not become a formalized game mechanic until the following generation of games. The text in that early game was referring to something that did not yet officially exist. The word came before the system, it was meant to describe. It is one of those small textual echoes that reveal how development works in practice, how language sometimes anticipates mechanics that are still being designed, how the words written into a game during production can survive into the final release, even when the ideas they were originally paired with have since been refined or relocated elsewhere in the system. There is something almost poetic about it when considered from a certain angle. A child in a fictional world described a game feature in the only language available to her, and that description persisted across a generational divide in the game's release history, preserved in amber by the simple accident of nobody noticing that the word was pointing forward rather than backward. Most players understand intuitively that a Pokemon team is composed of 6 members, 6 slots, 6 creatures, 6 sets of moves, and held items and carefully managed health points. It has been this way since the very beginning of the games, and 6 has the feel of something permanent and unchallenged, a number so fundamental to the experience that questioning it almost feels beside the point. But there is a corner case in the rules, a specific mechanical edge that technically allows a team to hold 36 individual Pokemon in those 6 slots simultaneously. Dugtrio is the relevant Pokemon here. Dugtrio is classified as a single Pokemon, but it is visually and conceptually composed of 3 Diglett. When the games process a team that contains 6 Dugtrio, they acknowledge 6 individual registered Pokemon, and yet the physical reality depicted on screen involves 18 distinct creatures sharing 3 heads per body. The same logic applies to Exeggcute, the 6-egg cluster Pokemon that counts as a single entity despite being visually presented as a group of distinct individuals. 6 Exeggcute on a team means 6 registered entries and 36 visible eggs distributed across that roster. It is a technicality rather than a meaningful gameplay option, and the games do not acknowledge it as anything unusual. But the underlying question it raises about what a Pokemon actually is, where the line between one creature and many falls within the logic of this world, is not a trivial question. The games have simply chosen not to engage with it directly, which is itself a kind of answer, a decision to let the technicality exist at the edge of the rules without ever requiring the rules to clarify their own position on what they mean. There are places in the geography of these games where small visual details land in ways that only become remarkable much later, when the games those details were placed in have been followed by sequels and expansions that nobody was thinking about at the time of their original creation. A random building in a city that was introduced in one generation contains crystalline structures in its decor that bear a striking visual resemblance to the Terra crystals that would define the core mechanic of a game released more than a decade later. The crystals in that building look like the formations associated with terrestrialization, the transformation system of the Paldea region. In the same game, inside the museum belonging to one of the gym leaders, there is a display artifact described as ancient festive wear. The description of that item aligns remarkably closely with the cultural traditions depicted in the Kitakami DLC region, a setting that would not exist until many years after the museum display was first written. And in the gym of a character named Lenora, two books visible on a bookshelf at the back of the room are colored in the exact shades of scarlet and violet that would eventually become the names of a pair of games released roughly a decade after that gym was first designed. Whether these are genuine foreshadowing or the product of reading too much meaning into coincidental visual decisions is a question the games themselves never answer. The people who designed those details are not in the habit of providing clarification on points like this. But the consistency of the pattern, the way these small visual details keep landing in ways that resonate with later developments, makes the question itself feel worth asking. This world is built by people who pay close attention to the things they place inside it, and close attention sometimes leaves traces that survive much longer than the moment that generated them. There is a berry in Pokémon that has the unusual distinction of being described within the games themselves as a myth. The Starf Berry is a real item that can be obtained by a player who is sufficiently dedicated to the right tasks, but the path to obtaining it is so demanding that the in-game text acknowledges the rarity, not just mechanically, but narratively. It calls that item something approaching a legend, a thing that exists in rumor more confidently than it exists in anyone's hand. The requirements attached to the Starfberry across various games have included clearing all 7 gold symbols from the battle frontier in Pokemon Emerald, a task that demands sustained mastery across every challenge format that Facility offers. Another path in a different game required accumulating the nearly impossible total of 99.999 million steps on the Pokewalker accessory, a pedometer peripheral that tracked physical movement in the real world and converted it into in-game bonuses. A third path required winning 200 consecutive battles in a row at specific competitive facilities. When the berry is finally obtained through any of these means, it holds a relatively modest function in battle, raising a random stat when the holder drops to low health. The reward, in pure mechanical terms, is not proportional to the effort required to claim it, but there is something in that disproportion that feels almost intentional, like a piece of the game that was designed less to be useful and more to exist as a monument to the players who would pursue it anyway. The Starf Berry is a certificate of dedication that happens to also be an item, and the game is honest enough to tell you in its own quiet way that only a very specific kind of person was ever really expected to find one. The Pokemon trading card game has generated many thousands of cards across its history, and the overwhelming majority of those cards function reasonably within the rules of the game that contains them. But occasionally, a card appears that raises the question of whether the people who designed it fully understood what they were designing, or whether they understood perfectly and simply made a choice that prioritized some other consideration over competitive viability. The Dialga card from the Call of Legends expansion sits firmly in this category. For an investment of 4 metal energy, which is a significant and specific cost by the standards of any card game, the time rewind attack offered by that card deals 70 damage. 70 damage is not a meaningful number for that energy cost in any context where the game has a reasonable power baseline. But the attack does not stop there. After dealing that modest damage, it requires the player to shuffle their entire hand of cards back into their deck. In a trading card game, a hand is a resource. Losing a hand is not just a setback, it is a condition that can cascade into an unrecoverable position depending on what that hand contained and how close the game was to its turning point. The combination of inadequate damage output and severe self punishment built into the same attack makes the Time Rewind Dialga one of those cards that functions as a kind of negative example, a useful illustration of the outer limits of what a game can ask of its players, before the request stops making sense as strategy and starts reading as something closer to an in game penalty for choosing to use the card at all. It remains in the historical record of the game as a curiosity more than a tool, remembered primarily for the question it prompts rather than for any game it ever decided. In the Pokémon anime, an enormous and varied catalog of stories has accumulated across more than 2 decades of continuous production. Within that catalog are films, side episodes, specials, and canonical insertions that most viewers encounter only by chance rather than by design. One of those buried stories involves a Marowak, the evolved form of Cubone, who takes a starring role in an in universe film depicting a Pokemon that falls in love with a Wigglytuff. The story ends in loss. The Marowak is overwhelmed by a group of wild Pokemon and does not survive. The film exists within the world of the anime as a cultural artifact, a movie that characters in the Pokemon world would recognize and reference as they reference anything else that belongs to shared cultural memory. And it achieves the kind of gentle, understated sadness that arises when a story about a creature loving something and losing everything because of it is placed inside a world that usually resolves such things more cleanly. A few episodes after this in universe film is mentioned, Ash walks past a promotional poster for it in a passing scene. The reference is brief and unannounced, but it confirms that the world remembered the story and that the anime was paying attention to its own continuity in the small ways that matter to the people who pay attention to small things. That Marowak existed in the logic of this world in a film that played somewhere in theaters to an audience of people and Pokemon who responded to it the way any audience responds to a story that moves them. And then the story ended and the world continued, and a boy walked past a poster of it while the camera held for just long enough to confirm that the moment had not been forgotten. The naming of Pokemon is one of the subtler powers available to a player across most games in the series. At the start of a journey, a name is assigned, and the game builds its relationship between player and creature, partly around that assignment. There are moments in the franchise, however, where the power of naming shifts in ways that carry more narrative weight than the typical starter naming sequence. In Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, two legendary creatures that would eventually be named Koraidon and Miraidon began their story under entirely different designations. The professors of those games, Sada and Turo respectively, had their own names for these creatures during their research. They called them Wing King and Iron Serpent. These names described what the professors observed about the creatures functionally and physically, but they did not constitute the names that the world would ultimately attach to them. The player character names them properly at a particular point in the story, making Koraidon and Miraidon the second and third Pokemon to be named by a main character in the history of the franchise. The first was Silvally, named by Gladion in Sun and Moon. The significance of this detail rests in how it positions the player character's role within the story. Naming is not incidental here. It is an act of recognition, a moment where the person holding the name acknowledges the creature fully enough to give it something permanent. Wing King and Iron Serpent were working titles, practical handles for creatures still being understood. Koraidon and Miraidon are names given in relationship, given after the creatures had become something more than subjects of study. The transition from one name to the other marks a shift in how the world relates to them, and it was the player who made that shift possible. The Pokédoll, one of the most practically useful items in the original Pokémon games, takes the shape of a small plush figure. That figure is not a generic creature or an abstract shape. It is specifically modeled after Clefairy, the round and pink and perpetually cheerful fairy Pokémon that inhabits the slopes of Mount Moon in Kanto. The reason for this specific choice traces back to a decision that was almost made at the very beginning of the franchise's public facing life. Clefairy was the original candidate for the role that Pikachu ultimately came to occupy. The designers at Game Freak had initially envisioned Clefairy as the mascot creature, the Pokemon that would appear on packaging and promotional material, and that Ash's counterpart in the anime would receive as a first companion. The decision to shift away from Clefairy and toward Pikachu came from a desire for a design that felt more universally approachable across genders, more visually distinctive at small sizes, and more naturally energetic in its core silhouette. Pikachu was the answer to those requirements. Clefairy was quietly set aside, but the Pokédoll persists as a monument to the version of the franchise that might have been. Every time a player uses one to escape a wild battle, they are deploying a miniature version of the Pokémon that was almost the face of the entire series. It is the kind of artifact that sits in plain sight for years, completely transparent in its function, until the context behind it is supplied, and suddenly it is carrying a history that a simple escape item has no particular obligation to carry. The sounds that Pokemon make in the anime are produced by voice actors, and the instructions those actors receive shape the performances in ways that do not always land where the creators intended. There is a production note attributed to Game Freak regarding the cry of one Pokemon in particular, a small and round Pokemon with a trunk, known in the English-speaking world as Fanpy. The note states that Fanpy's cry was intended to sound like Mickey Mouse, the Disney character whose voice has been a constant across a century of animation and cultural presence. When placed beside its counterpart, this detail opens into something even stranger. Totodile, the water-type starter from the Johto games, has been observed to produce a cry that carries a resemblance to Donald Duck, another Disney character whose distinctive vocal quality is among the most immediately recognizable in the history of entertainment. Whether these resemblances were genuinely designed in decisions or the product of coincidental overlap in how certain animal characters are typically voiced in Japanese animation is not entirely clear. But the note about Fanpy confirms that at least one comparison between a Pokemon's voice and a Disney character was intentional enough to be documented. The fact that two different Pokemon from the same generation carry associations with two different famous Disney voices, one officially documented and one arrived at through observation, is one of those coincidences that feels like something more than coincidence, but cannot quite be verified to be anything different. It sits in the comfortable space between confirmed and speculative, which is exactly where many of the most interesting facts in this world tend to live. Dragon Quest is a Japanese role-playing game franchise with a history that predates Pokémon and that left a visible imprint on the early creature designs of the series. The visual influence is not something that the creators of Pokémon have categorically denied, and when the designs of early Pokémon are placed beside certain Dragon Quest monsters, the connections become difficult to dismiss as purely coincidental. The resemblances appear across a broad range of the original roster. Caterpie shares visual ground with a creature called Killer Pillar. Golbat echoes the design language of an enemy type called Draki. Geodude carries similarities to a creature named Frostburn. Shelter finds a counterpart in a design called Morphin. Ghastly bears resemblance to a creature known as Miasma, and the visual comparison between Tangela and a Dragon Quest creature called Bagworm is striking enough to have generated sustained conversation among people who study the history of both franchises. The list extends further than these examples and touches a significant portion of the original 151. This is not unusual in the history of creative work. Influences flow between projects and between creators, especially within the same industry at the same moment in time. What makes the Dragon Quest connection notable is the extent of the overlap and the specificity with which certain design elements appear to have been translated or reworked across the transition. The creatures that emerged from this process were genuinely original, genuinely their own things, but they arrived at that originality carrying the visible traces of where some of their ideas had passed through on the way. The Pokédex entries for individual Pokémon are among the most creatively abundant texts in all of gaming, capable of ranging from the benign and natural to the genuinely unsettling within the space of 2 or 3 sentences. Drampa, a normal and dragon type introduced in Sun and Moon, has a Pokédex entry in the Ultra Sun version of those games that occupies the far end of the tonal spectrum from anything most players would expect from a creature with such a gentle, long bearded, grandfather like visual design. The entry states that if a child that Drampa has befriended is bullied by someone, Drampa will locate the home of the bully and burn it to the ground, not damage it, not frighten the occupants, burn it to the ground. This is presented as a matter-of-fact description of behavioral tendency, delivered in the same measured and informational tone that every other entry in the Pokédex uses to describe sleeping habits or dietary preferences. A Pokémon card exists that depicts 2 children riding joyfully on Drampa's back through what appears to be a well-kept residential neighborhood. With the Pokédex entry as context, the image carries a different weight than it was likely designed to carry. The disconnect between Drampa's design language and its described behavior is itself a kind of design choice, the decision to place something quietly extreme inside something that looks extremely quiet. It is the kind of detail that makes the Pokédex texts so endlessly rereadable. The entries have always been willing to go further than the visual designs suggest, and Drampa is one of the clearest examples of that willingness being exercised without the slightest change in tone or register. There is a hidden mechanic accessible in the character selection screen of Super Smash Bros. Melee that relates to Pokémon in a way that is both obscure and oddly charming. In tournament mode for that game, if a player holds a specific combination of buttons during the character selection process, the selected fighter's icon is replaced by the image of a Ditto. This signals that the character's identity will be randomly determined at the moment the match begins, removing the advanced knowledge of opponent character from both players simultaneously. The choice to use Ditto for this function is entirely appropriate, given that Ditto is the Pokémon whose entire identity is built around the concept of taking the shape of whatever it encounters. A creature that has no fixed form of its own becomes the symbol for a selection process that refuses to commit to any specific choice until the last possible moment. It is one of those design decisions where the meaning of the symbol and the function of what it represents happen to be the same thing, and the alignment between them is complete enough that it needs no explanation to communicate its own logic. There is also, connected to this same game, the fact that Ditto was at one point planned to appear as a Pokeball summon within Melee itself. A Pokeball thrown in Smash Bros. Releases a Pokemon that performs an action and then disappears. Ditto was designed and coded for this role, but was removed before the game's release, reportedly because of technical instability that the design was introducing into an already complicated system. It exists in the shadow history of Melee as a ghost character, fully designed but never shipped, another small piece of the Ditto story that arrived in the wrong order and was quietly put aside. The Game Corner, the casino-styled entertainment venue present in the original Kanto and Johto games, always had its prizes distributed through a structure that separated the gambling element from the reward element by means of a building. You earned coins at the machines in one building. You exchanged those coins for prizes in a different building. This arrangement felt arbitrary to most players, an oddly bureaucratic way of managing what should have been a simple transaction. But the arrangement was not arbitrary. It mirrored a specific and well established legal workaround used by pachinko parlors in Japan. Japanese gambling law prohibits the direct exchange of gambling winnings for cash. Pachinko parlors, however, developed a three-party system that navigated around this restriction. The parlor would award special tokens to winning players. The players would then sell those tokens to a separate vendor operating nearby, one that was formally unaffiliated with the parlor but practically adjacent to it in every meaningful sense. That vendor would then sell the tokens back to the parlor, completing a loop that converted winnings into cash through a middleman that provided just enough legal distance to satisfy the letter of the law. The game corner in Pokemon replicates this structure almost exactly, with the coin earning taking place in one location and the coin spending taking place in another. It is the kind of detail that makes complete sense immediately once the context is provided, and makes slightly less sense than it used to once you realize how specific its origins are. A mechanic in a children's game about collecting creatures was quietly encoding the logic of a Japanese legal workaround that most players in any country would have had no particular reason to recognize. The name for alternate colored Pokemon has not always been the word shiny. The terminology has changed multiple times across the history of the franchise, and tracing those changes reveals something about how the designers themselves understood what they had created and how that understanding evolved over time. In the original Gold and Silver games, these creatures were referred to simply as rare Pokemon, a designation that communicated scarcity without describing the visual quality that made them distinctive. In Pokemon Stadium 2, the localization team used the phrase color Pokemon, which moved closer to describing the phenomenon, but still did not name it with any particular precision. Generation 3's Easy Chat system, the in-game communication tool, referred to them as alternate color Pokemon, an accurate description that treated the difference as a variation rather than a quality. The trading card game, operating on its own terminology track, used the terms shining and star at different points in its own development. Each of these names was doing the same job, but none of them quite managed to capture the specific visual impression of a Pokemon whose coat catches the light differently, whose coloration carries a quality of brightness that the standard version does not possess. The word shiny became officially embedded in the franchise's own vocabulary during the fourth generation when it was used in promotional materials for a specific event Pokemon distribution. That single use established the term within the franchise's own documentation, and from that anchoring point, it spread into everything. Players had been using the word informally long before the games adopted it, which means that in this case, fan language preceded official vocabulary. The community named the phenomenon before the franchise did, and the franchise eventually agreed. Pokemon Black and White, the pair of games released for the Nintendo DS that introduced the Unova region and its emphasis on a fresh start, were developed with an ambitious original intention that did not survive fully intact into the final design. They were conceived, at least in part, as a soft reboot of the Pokemon concept. The initial vision included a new roster of Pokemon designed to parallel existing archetypes rather than build on them directly. A new Pokemon designed to occupy a similar role to the Psychic Pokemon from Generation 1, a new Construction Pokemon, a new Pokemon associated with fighting arts, a new creature intended to echo the visual logic of trash-based designs from earlier in the franchise. Images from this early development period show a roster that feels simultaneously familiar and completely new, creatures that are clearly in conversation with what came before without being derivative of it. The final games do contain many original designs that operate independently of earlier generations, but the degree to which the reboot concept was pursued in the early stages is more extreme than the finished product suggests. Some of that early design work was retained, some of it was adjusted, some of it was replaced with the Pokémon that eventually appeared in the released games. The trace of that original intention is legible in the early materials for anyone who goes looking, and in some ways, the reboot that was planned and the game that was released are both worth understanding because the distance between them reveals something about the choices that were made in the space between the first draft and the final version, about what was kept and what was quietly reconsidered. The reason Bonsly has an anatomical feature that strikes most observers as incongruous with the aesthetic of a small rock type baby Pokemon modeled after a bonsai tree is a matter of horticultural engineering rather than any more colorful explanation. Bonsai trees, when grown in containers, require drainage holes in the base of the pot that allows excess water to escape rather than accumulate at the roots. These holes are a practical necessity of the cultivation process and appear in essentially all ceramic vessels designed to hold living plants. Bonsly's design incorporated this feature, translating a functional element of the object it was modeled after into a visual detail on the creature itself. The reasoning behind this choice reflects a design principle visible throughout the Pokemon roster. Specific and accurate details drawn from the real-world subjects that inspire a design tend to produce more distinctive and memorable creatures than generic shapes assembled without that specificity. The drainage hole is not decoration. It is documentation, a visual note that the designers knew precisely what a bonsai pot looks like and committed to representing it honestly rather than smoothing it into something more immediately appealing. The fact that this specificity produces a result that most viewers initially receive as strange rather than clever says something about how design literacy works in practice. A detail that rewards familiarity with the original subject reads as oddity to anyone without that familiarity. Bonsly carries its horticultural knowledge openly, without explanation, and trusts that the viewer who brings the relevant context will understand immediately what they are looking at and why it had to be exactly this way. Pokemon Box Ruby and Sapphire occupies a specific position in the history of GameCube software that has nothing to do with the content of the game itself and everything to do with how many copies of it were ever produced. The game, which provided GameCube players with a Pokemon storage system accessible from their Game Boy Advance cartridges, was not a major commercial release in any market. It was a functional accessory title, purchased by dedicated players who needed what it offered and largely ignored by everyone else. The result is a physical rarity that has driven its secondary market price to somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000, depending on condition and availability. The only GameCube software that is considered rarer on the second-hand market is a bundle package combining Sonic Heroes and Super Monkey Ball, which has been known to reach prices between $2,000 and $4,000. The existence of these extreme valuations tells a story about the economics of limited physical media in an age of digital preservation, about how scarcity and collector interest combine to transform something that was once simply a product into something closer to an artifact. Most of the players who owned Pokemon Box Ruby and Sapphire in its original release had no particular reason to preserve it beyond its functional usefulness, which means that many copies were sold, traded, or discarded as circumstances changed. The copies that remained in good condition became progressively rarer as the gaming market moved away from the hardware generation they required, and the rarity compounded until it reached the prices the market now reflects. The game is, in the most literal sense, worth more than its original purchasers had any reason to imagine it would ever be. There is an area in Legends, Arceus, set in the ancient version of the Sinnoh region, a location called the Cobalt Coastlands, that carries more historical weight than its name might initially suggest. A video game released years before Legends, Arceus, the Nintendo 64 title Heyu, Pikachu, included within its game world a location called Cobalt Coast. The visual treatment of the two locations, despite being separated by decades of development history and multiple hardware generations, bears a resemblance significant enough that players familiar with both games have noted it consistently. Whether this represents intentional foreshadowing planted in a relatively obscure Nintendo 64 title, or whether the designers of Legends, Arceus, were working from a similar visual vocabulary and arrived at a similar result independently, is a question that carries no definitive answer. What is certain is that the connection was noticed and that it has generated considerable discussion among the portion of the player community invested in finding the threads that connect different parts of this world's long history to each other. The Pokémon franchise has been generating content for long enough that connections between older and newer releases are sometimes genuine design decisions and sometimes the product of working in a shared creative tradition across a long enough timeline that repetitions and resonances become statistically likely. The Cobalt Coastlands and Cobalt Coast sit at the uncertain intersection of both possibilities, which is exactly where the most interesting questions about this franchise tend to live. Machoke is a Pokemon that most players encounter during the middle stretch of any journey through Kanto, a muscular fighting type that serves as the bridge between the small and unassuming Machop and the powerful Machamp that evolves from it through trade. The belt that Machoke wears is a visual feature so integrated into its design that most players process it as purely aesthetic, a piece of visual character building that communicates the creature's connection to martial discipline and physical training. But the belt is not cosmetic in the logic of the Pokemon world. According to the yellow version Pokédex entry for Machoke, the belt is functional. It actively suppresses the Pokemon's power, moderating what would otherwise be an uncontrollable level of physical strength. Without the belt, the entry suggests, Machoke would be unstoppable. The implication is that Machoke is not at its full capacity during any of the battles the player fights with it. It is performing at a reduced power level contained by the device around its waist, because the full expression of what it is capable of is not something the world can safely accommodate in an everyday context. This detail transforms the belt from a costume element into a narrative object, something that the world of the game contains because it must, because the creature wearing it requires containment as a condition of functioning within ordinary society. It also transforms every battle Machoke wins into something slightly more impressive than it appears, because every victory is achieved while the creature is operating at diminished capacity by design. The Space World demonstration of 1997 was not just the first appearance of shiny Pokemon. It also contained type assignments for early designs of Pokemon that would eventually appear in gold and silver with different typings. Sneasel, the sharp-clawed dark and ice type that appears in the final games as a creature built around speed and precision, was at that stage classified as a pure psychic type. Ho-Oh, which arrived in the final games as fire and flying and eventually became one of the most beloved legendaries in the franchise, existed in the demo as a pure flying type. Umbreon, the dark type evolution of Eevee that has remained one of the most popular evolutions since its introduction, was in that early demo assigned as a pure poison type. These alternate typings from the demo invite a kind of imaginative exercise about how different the games might have felt if those assignments had survived. A psychic type Sneasel would have played very differently in the hands of a trainer building a competitive team with a completely different set of strengths and vulnerabilities to manage. A pure flying type Ho-Oh would have been susceptible to rock moves in a way that the fire typing of the final version partially compensates for. A poison type Umbreon would have had no immunity to psychic moves, which is one of the features that makes the dark typing of the final Umbreon such a significant part of its competitive identity. The decisions that shifted these typings between the demo and the final game were practical ones, made for reasons of game balance and narrative coherence. But the alternate versions persist in the historical record as a reminder of how much the identity of a Pokémon can rest on a single classification and how different the experience of using a creature can be when that classification changes. Gudra, the pseudo-legendary dragon type introduced in the Kalos region games, has a visual design built around a specific aesthetic of softness and rounded, almost liquid movement. Its coloration, particularly the greenish oxidized hue of certain parts of its design, combined with the fact that Onova, the region that came before Kalos in the game release timeline, is modeled on the geography and visual culture of New York City, has led many observers to the conclusion that Gudra is at least partially inspired by the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty's iconic green color comes from the same chemical process, the oxidation of copper in open air, that Gudra's color palette seems to echo. The connection between a dragon-type Pokémon and one of the most recognizable statues in the world feels unusual until you consider that Pokémon design has always worked by taking disparate sources and synthesizing them into something new and self-contained. The statue as inspiration is no more unlikely than a medieval sword as inspiration or a type of butterfly as inspiration. What makes the Gudra connection particularly interesting is that the inspiration, if it exists as intended, is carried through color and texture rather than through any direct visual reference to the statue's form. It is a subtle kind of influence, the kind that operates at the level of impression rather than imitation, and it is exactly the kind of influence that the best Pokémon designs tend to carry. The creature does not look like the Statue of Liberty. It simply carries something of the same weight of presence, the same quiet quality of being something large and green and unexpectedly gentle for its size. Pokémon Sleep, the application released for mobile platforms that tracks and gamifies the experience of sleeping, confirmed something about Arcanine's physical appearance that had been ambiguous in every other visual representation of the Pokémon across its entire history. Arcanine's belly, the pale area visible on the creature's underside in most of its depictions, had always been rendered with a coloration that could be read as either off-white or pale in a way that left the exact shade somewhat open to interpretation depending on the context. In Pokémon Sleep's rendering of Arcanine, the belly is depicted in a solid black that makes the coloration explicit in a way that none of the previous representations had fully committed to. The decision to render it this way was presumably deliberate, a choice made with access to whatever design documentation exists for the creature and confirmed as accurate by the people responsible for maintaining consistency in how Arcanine is depicted. The detail matters less for what it reveals about Arcanine specifically than for what it demonstrates about Pokémon Sleep as a source of design clarification. An application about sleep and rest, built around the premise of laying your phone beside you as you drift off and letting it measure the quality of your rest through the night, became in this instance a definitive reference document on a question of Pokémon anatomy that had persisted without resolution across decades of games, anime, cards, and merchandise. The most unexpected sources sometimes carry the most authoritative answers. Pokémon Crystal, the third version of the second generation of games, contains within its geography a small interactive detail that exists entirely for the pleasure of the player who discovers it, rather than for any functional purpose within the game's structure. In the city where the game's communication center is located, the city where Eevee can be obtained as a gift, there is a building with stairs leading up to a higher level. If the player stands at the top of those stairs and interacts with a specific point in the environment, the character's action triggers a description of drawing a mustache on something, almost certainly on a Mario, given the visual sensibility of the time period and the nature of the reference being made. It is the kind of Easter egg that rewards the player who explores thoroughly and interacts with the environment in ways that serve no practical purpose. There is nothing to gain from finding it beyond the small, private satisfaction of having discovered that the people who built this world included a hidden joke that most people who ever played the game never encountered. The detail communicates something about the people who put it there, about the pleasure they took in building a world that could contain secrets entirely removed from the functional systems of the game, secrets that existed purely because they were enjoyable to hide. The best versions of the Pokemon games have always had this quality. They have always contained more than they required to function, and the excess has always been placed with intention rather than deposited by accident. The mustache in Pokemon Crystal is a small example of that intention, hidden in a corner of the map where it would go unnoticed by anyone who was not curious enough to look. 4 starter Pokemon across the history of the main series games are visually and conceptually based on birds. Torchic, the fire-type chick of the Hoenn region. Piplup, the water-type penguin of Sinnoh. Rowlet, the grass and flying-type grass owl of Alola. Quaxley, the water-type duckling of Paldea. All 4 of these Pokemon carry the visual identity of birds from their earliest forms, and all 4 have been designated as starter Pokemon, the creatures offered to players at the beginning of their journey as their first and most foundational companions. What none of them have in common with birds is their final typing. Blaziken, the final form of Torchic, is fire and fighting. Empoleon, the final form of Piplup, is water and steel. Decidueye, the final form of Rowlet in most versions, is grass and ghost. Quaquaval, the final form of Quaxley, is water and fighting. Not one of these fully evolved bird starters carries the flying type that their visual designs most naturally suggest. The bird starter tradition and the flying type tradition are entirely parallel lines that never intersect across any of the 4 examples currently available in the franchise. Whether this is a deliberate creative choice, a kind of running visual subversion built into the design tradition of bird starters, or simply the product of independent decisions that happen to have produced a consistent pattern, is not clear. But the pattern itself is consistent enough that it has to have been noticed at some point in the development process, and the absence of any exception to it suggests that if it was noticed, the decision was made to keep it as it was rather than to break it for the sake of variety. There is an experience point system in Pokemon that most players never encounter, and that sits at the extreme end of the leveling curve in a way that would require extraordinary dedication to fully explore. The fluctuating experience group requires 1.64 million experience points to bring a Pokemon from level 1 to level 100. For context, legendary Pokemon, which are typically among the most powerful creatures in any game, and which tend to be given generous experience curves to reflect their status, generally require approximately 1.25 million experience points to reach the same maximum level. The fluctuating group demands more experience than the legendary group. Most of the Pokemon assigned to this experience group come from the Hoenn region, which is notable in itself, given that the group is obscure enough that most players who have spent their gaming time primarily in Hoenn might never have identified it or known they were participating in it. The exception to the Hoenn dominance of this group is a single Pokemon from a different region entirely, Drifloon, the small balloon-like ghost type from Sinnoh. Its inclusion in a group otherwise dominated by Hoenn creatures is one of those small, unexplained details that sits in the data without a clear narrative justification, a categorization that was made at some point by someone with access to the underlying systems, and that has never been given any particular context. The fluctuating group functions in the low levels as a faster leveling experience than many other groups. The same Pokemon that demands 1.64 million experience to reach level 100 levels faster than the average at the beginning of its journey. The curve fluctuates. It is rapid early and extraordinarily demanding later, which gives the group its name and its distinctive quality of making early training feel deceptively simple before the requirements become genuinely steep. The move explosion is one of the most mechanically extreme options available in the standard move pool, a self destructive attack that deals substantial damage at the cost of the user immediately fainting. Its classification as a normal type move means that under ordinary circumstances, it does not receive the same type attack bonus that fire types get from fire moves or fighting types get from fighting moves. No normal type Pokemon is expected to benefit from stab on explosion because the self destructive nature of the move usually makes the bonus irrelevant in a practical sense. The user is gone after using it, regardless of whether the boost applied. But Lickitung, and by extension, its evolution Lickilicky, and Swalot, the poison type stomach Pokemon, are normal types that can learn explosion. This means they are, in the specific terminology of the game's damage calculation system, able to receive the same type attack bonus on the most destructive one-use move in the game. Whether this is practically useful in competitive contexts is a separate question from whether it is technically true. It is technically true, and the combination of creature and move is singular enough that it exists as a note in the history of the game's mechanical landscape, a small detail that rewards the player who notices it with a moment of recognition that this specific combination could only exist in exactly this way. The move's history extends far enough that the creatures who can learn it with the bonus represent a very specific intersection of design decisions made at different times by different people, any one of whom might have prevented the combination from existing if a slightly different choice had been made along the way. Clefable holds a distinction in the world of Pokemon mechanics that most players would not think to examine closely, and that reveals something about how the creature was designed relative to the systems that govern what any individual Pokemon can learn. When the move pool is assessed across level up moves, breeding moves, and technical machine moves simultaneously, Clefable carries a larger number of learnable moves than any other single Pokemon in the franchise. The breadth of that pool is not a recent development, but has persisted across multiple generations of games, maintained and extended as new moves were added, and as Clefable's compatibility with new technical machines was determined. This mechanical richness is something of a counterpoint to Clefable's visual design, which presents a creature of soft edges and gentle colors that does not immediately communicate the strategic flexibility that its move list suggests. The design language says one thing, and the mechanical reality says another, and the two are connected only by the creature's identity as a fairy type with connections to the moon and to a kind of cosmic benevolence that in the logic of this world comes paired with the capacity to do almost anything. Clefable's move pool breadth is itself a kind of storytelling, a mechanical expression of a creature whose connection to the world is wide enough that almost nothing within it falls beyond the reach of its potential. The largest move pool in the franchise belongs to a round, pink, moon-associated fairy whose design gives no particular indication that this is the case. The contrast is part of what makes the detail worth knowing. Nihilego's name, in the Japanese language of etymology, carries a meaning that operates at the level of philosophical statement rather than creature description. The name is derived from two Latin words, nihil, which means nothing, and ego, which means I am. The combined meaning reads as I am nothing, a statement of profound emptiness delivered in the name of a creature that in the logic of the ultra wormhole storyline of Sun and Moon is a parasitic entity that latches onto a host and amplifies their negative traits and suppressed desires to a destructive extreme. The creature whose name means I am nothing survives by attaching itself to something else and filling that something else with the magnified version of whatever is already there. It has no self of its own, only the capacity to intensify the selves it encounters. The name is not decorative. It is a description of a fundamental existential condition built into the creature's design, delivered in a language that most players of the games would not be expected to parse, placed there for the players who would look carefully enough to find it and understand what they had found. This is the kind of naming depth that runs throughout the franchise, but is rarely as explicitly philosophical as it is in Nihilego case. Most Pokemon names describe appearance or function or reference real-world animals or phenomena. Nihilego's name describes a metaphysical state, and it does so in the language of classical scholarship, which adds one more layer of deliberate obscurity to something that was already several steps removed from the surface level of what the games ask of their players. Haunter and Gengar are paired Pokemon connected by evolution and by the visual logic that makes Gengar feel like the more powerful and more fully realized version of what Haunter represents. But in terms of physical size, the relationship between them is inverted in a way that most players would not expect. Haunter, the intermediate stage, is 5 feet and 3 inches tall in its official Pokédex measurements. Gengar, the final and most powerful form, measures 4 feet and 11 inches. Haunter is physically larger than the Pokemon it evolves into. This reversal of the typical size progression between evolution stages reflects a design philosophy that was not always oriented toward biological realism, where creatures typically become larger and more imposing as they develop. The ghost-type lineage of Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar was clearly designed with other priorities in mind, priorities that favored visual distinctiveness and personality over any consistent logic of scale. Haunter's elongated disembodied hands and floating gaseous form create a silhouette that occupies more space than Gengar's shorter, rounder, more concentrated presence, even though Gengar is in every mechanical and narrative sense the dominant creature of the two. The measurement difference is small enough that in practice, the distinction carries no particular consequence within the games. But it is one of those details that rewrites the visual relationship between two creatures once it is known, making it impossible to look at Haunter and Gengar side by side without the height discrepancy, adding something to the picture that was not there before. Route 113 in the Hoenn region, the route that runs through the ashfall north of Fowlerbor town, contains a Pokemon encounter pool with a property that no other route in the entire franchise replicates. Every wild Pokemon that can be encountered on that route begins with the same letter. The 4 Pokemon available in the tall grass of Route 113 are Sandshrew, Skarmory, Spinda, and Slugma. All 4 names begin with the letter S, without exception, forming a roster that reads like a design decision made after the fact, or an accidental result of building encounter tables one Pokemon at a time without noticing the pattern that was emerging. Whether this was intentional or coincidental is a question the games leave open, and the answer may genuinely be uncertain even among the people who assembled the encounter data for that route. What is certain is that the result is unique, a route whose wild encounter pool forms a perfectly uniform initial letter pattern that no other route anywhere in the franchise has been found to replicate. It is the kind of detail that only becomes visible when someone looks at the encounter data from a specific angle, asking a question that the game was not designed to answer directly. The route's ash-covered landscape gives it a distinctive visual texture that makes it one of the more memorable environments in the Hoenn games, and the All-S encounter pool adds one more layer of distinctiveness to a location that was already set apart from the roots around it. Whether the letter pattern was planned or discovered after the fact, it belongs to the root now, as permanently as the ash that falls on it. Rattata is a normal type Pokemon in the most foundational sense, the creature that appears in the earliest areas of the original game as the representative of what wild Pokemon encounters feel like before the journey has developed enough to offer variety or surprise. It is not a fire type. It is not related to any fire type in its evolutionary line. By the standard logic of move compatibility, there is no particular reason to expect Rattata to have any relationship to fire-based attacks. And yet Rattata is capable of learning the move Flame Wheel, and it does so specifically through the breeding mechanic, which means it requires careful training decisions to achieve but is not unavailable to a patient player. The reasoning behind this compatibility traces to Japanese mythology, specifically to the Kasha, a spirit described in folklore as a burning cat or rat that moves at extraordinary speed and is associated with fire. Rattata's connection to the Kasha through Flame Wheel is one of those cultural reference points that is embedded in the game's data in a way that most players in any country would have no immediate access to, available only to those who either recognize the reference from cultural familiarity or encounter the explanation through research. The game does not explain this connection. It simply makes the move available and allows the compatibility to exist as a quiet note for players who notice that a normal type rat can carry a fire type move and ask why. The answer, when found, reveals a layer of deliberate cultural reference operating below the surface of something that most players would process as merely mechanical. In Pokémon Yellow, the player's rival character Blue carries an Eevee throughout the early portions of the game, the counterpart to the player's Pikachu. Eevee is famously the most versatile creature in the franchise in terms of evolutionary potential, capable of developing into one of multiple different final forms depending on the conditions surrounding its development. In Yellow, the form that Blue's Eevee ultimately takes is not fixed by the game's script. It is determined by the player's performance in the two earliest battles against Blue that occur in the game's opening hours. If the player wins both of those initial battles, Blue's Eevee becomes a Jolteon, the electric type evolution. If the player loses both battles, the Eevee becomes a Vaporeon, the water type evolution. If the player wins one and loses the other, the Eevee becomes a Flareon, the fire type evolution. The game is building a responsive consequence into the storyline based on early performance, shaping the rival's team in a way that reflects the dynamic established between the two trainers in their earliest encounters. A more successful player faces a rival who developed differently than the rival of a player who struggled in those same moments. The elegance of this design is that it operates entirely beneath the surface of what most players focus on during those early battles. Players who win are focused on celebrating. Players who lose are focused on recovering. Neither group is likely to be tracking the consequence that their performance is quietly encoding into the rival's future development. The game is paying attention to something the player is not, and the result arrives much later as a fact about Blue's team that most players have no framework for explaining. Dire Claw is a move introduced in the Hisui-era game Legends Arceus, available to the Pokémon Sneasler, and it holds an unusual position in the history of status-inflicting moves. Most moves that have a secondary effect carry one secondary effect, or occasionally two, and those effects are typically a specific status condition with a fixed probability of occurring. Dire Claw carries multiple possible secondary effects simultaneously, an elevated critical hit ratio, and independent probabilities of inflicting sleep, paralysis, or poison on the target. Any one of these could trigger on a single use of the move, or in certain circumstances, multiple effects could accumulate. The result is a move that combines offensive potential with the widest spread of possible status outcomes available to any single move in the franchise. From a design standpoint, Dareclaw reads as an attempt to capture the unpredictable and dangerous quality of a creature that attacks with poisoned claws in the wild, where any scratch might carry any number of consequences depending on what the attacker carries. The move does not guarantee any specific outcome, but it maximizes the range of outcomes available, which is its own kind of power. The move exists as one of several design choices in Legends. Arceus that attempted to translate the creature's physical nature into mechanical terms more directly than the standard move system usually allows. The result is a move that feels more biological than most, as if it were drawing from something real about what contact with these claws would involve, rather than from the organized vocabulary of typed attack categories. Lapras carries its name in the English localization as a near direct reference to Pierre-Simon Laplace, a French mathematician whose contributions to probability theory and celestial mechanics place him among the most significant scientists of the 18th and early 19th centuries. One of Laplace's areas of sustained intellectual attention was the mathematics governing bodies of water, specifically the tidal forces that shape the movement of oceans. His work on tides and the physics of large water bodies produced foundational equations that remained in use long after his death. The connection between a water-type Pokémon, whose design evokes a plesiosaur gracefully navigating deep ocean, and a mathematician who spent significant portions of his career studying the forces that govern large bodies of water, is not accidental. The name choice reflects a deliberate decision to honor a specific intellectual legacy within a naming tradition that typically draws from more visually direct sources. Lapras did not need to be named after a mathematician. Most water-type Pokémon are named after the creatures or phenomena that inspired their visual design. The choice to name Lapras after Laplace instead communicates something about how the people who named it understood the creature, as something more connected to the science of water than to any specific animal that lives within it. The name is a small monument to a specific intellectual tradition, placed quietly inside one of the most beloved water-type Pokémon in the history of the franchise. Most players who have carried Lapras through hundreds of battles across multiple games are carrying the name of an 18th century mathematician without knowing it, which is exactly the kind of unannounced tribute that the naming tradition of this franchise has always been capable of containing. The Master Ball, the ultimate capture device in the Pokémon world, is presented within the games as the pinnacle of Pokéball technology, a sphere capable of catching any Pokémon without fail, the product of the most advanced research into capture mechanics that the game's scientific community has ever achieved. Most players receive one Master Ball per game. Hold it carefully for a moment that justifies its use, and think of it primarily in terms of its infallibility as a capture tool. The narrative context around the Master Ball, however, contains a darker implication buried in the design notes of a villain. According to documents accessible in Cyrus's computer in the Sinnoh games, the Master Ball does not simply catch Pokémon, it suppresses their power in order to do so. The ball works not by reaching an accommodation with the creature inside it, but by actively limiting what that creature can do, reducing a powerful being to something manageable by constraining the very qualities that made it formidable. This explains why Cyrus, who intended to use Dialga and Palkia as tools to reshape existence itself, created the Red Chain as his instrument of control instead of simply using Master Balls. He needed creatures at full power. The Master Ball would have made them unable to do what he required. The implication extends outward in a direction most players probably never follow to its conclusion. If catching Arceus in a Master Ball suppresses its power, then the version of Arceus that can be kept in a ball and used in battle is a diminished Arceus, not the unconstrained deity that Pokédex entries describe. The most powerful creature in the Pokemon world, captured and held, is something other than what it is when it is free. The ball changes what it contains by changing what the contained creature is capable of being. Shallow and cryogonal share a distinction in the Pokédex that arrives at the far end of the spectrum from the elaborate and poetic entries that define so many of the franchise's most celebrated creatures. Each of these two Pokemon has a Pokédex entry that consists of exactly 9 words. 9 words to describe an entire Pokemon, its nature, its behavior, its relationship to the world around it. Shallow's entry says that its shape and coloration vary depending on its habitat. Cryogonal's entry says that it can produce ultra cold air and that its body is frozen. Both entries deliver one functional piece of information and then stop. The brevity of these entries is not uniformly distributed across the Pokédex. Most entries are significantly longer, and many run to multiple sentences that develop a specific narrative or biological detail about the creature in question. The 9 word entries for these two Pokemon feel less like deliberate minimalism and more like the result of a practical constraint, perhaps a version of the Pokédex display that limited character count in a way that forced editors to cut until only the most essential information remained. Whatever the cause, the result is a pair of Pokemon whose official descriptions exist in the most compressed possible form, carrying just enough information to communicate that the creature exists and has one notable quality, without expanding on what that quality means or what life alongside such a creature would actually involve. The 9 word entry is a kind of negative space in the Pokédex, defined more by what it omits than by what it contains. Raiden holds a distinction in the development history of Pokémon that places it at the very beginning of something. It was the first Pokémon ever designed, the initial creature produced by Ken Sugimori and the early development team as they built the visual vocabulary that would eventually define an entire franchise. Everything that came after Raiden, every creature designed for every generation across every game that followed, exists downstream from this original act of creation. The Pokemon that appears in the games as relatively late numbered in the original roster, not among the earliest creatures a player typically encounters, was in fact the first one to exist. The significance of this fact is partly historical and partly something more philosophical. A franchise that has produced over 1,000 unique creatures began with a single creature, and that creature was not the one that most people would guess. It was not Pikachu, whose cultural prominence makes it feel foundational. It was not Mew, whose in-universe status as the ancestor of all Pokemon carries a similar aura of priority. It was Raiden, the large rhinoceros-inspired rock and ground type that most players encounter mid-game as a powerful but not particularly unusual opponent. There is a quiet consistency in how Raiden is treated across multiple games in the franchise. But many early game environments include Raiden statues near important buildings or at the entrances to significant locations. This detail, noticed by players who were looking for it, is understood as a kind of tribute to Raiden's status as the original, the first thing designed in a world of things that now numbers in the thousands. Poliwhirl's design contains a detail that is both immediately visible and rarely fully understood by the players who have looked at it hundreds of times across years of encounters. The circular swirl pattern on its belly, which is the most visually distinctive feature of the creature and the one that defines its iconic silhouette, is based on a specific biological observation about real frogs. Certain species of frog have skin translucent enough that internal organs are visible from outside the body. The intestines of these frogs, coiled within the abdomen, are visible through the skin as a swirling pattern that corresponds closely to the visual form that appears on Poliwhirl's exterior. The design is not abstract decoration. It is a representation of anatomy filtered through the visual language of a creature that is simultaneously naturalistic and stylized in the way that the best Pokemon designs always are. The swirl says something true about the biology of the real animal that inspired the design, but it says it in a way that is clean enough and simple enough to work as a defining visual feature for a creature that needs to be recognizable at small sizes and across multiple artistic contexts. The detail also adds a layer of biological consistency to the evolution line, because as the Pokemon develops from Poliwag through Poliwhirl to Poliwrath, the spiral remains present as a continuous visual element, tracing the creature's identity through its various forms. It is an anchor point that persists through change, the kind of design decision that feels inevitable once you understand where it came from. Tyranitar, the pseudo-legendary dark and rock type from the Johto region, carries a design inspiration that is among the most directly traceable in the franchise's entire visual history. The creature is modeled on Godzilla, the kaiju that has defined Japanese monster cinema since 1954, and that remains one of the most globally recognizable creature designs in the history of visual entertainment. The silhouette, the scale impressions on the body, the overall sense of a creature that should not be able to move as freely as it does given its apparent mass. All of these qualities connect Tyranitar to its source material in ways that are visible rather than speculative. The choice to build a pseudo-legendary around a Godzilla-derived design was itself a kind of acknowledgement that the franchise's creature vocabulary was in conversation with the traditions of monster design that preceded it and that had shaped the cultural imagination around large, powerful, and dangerous creatures in ways that Pokemon was inevitably drawing from. Tyranitar does not attempt to obscure or apologize for its inspiration. It inhabits the Godzilla aesthetic directly, making it the clearest example in the franchise of a design built around a specific and prominent cultural reference point that was embraced rather than transformed. The result is a creature whose identity as the Godzilla Pokemon is so stable that it required almost no additional design work to establish. The source material carried enough meaning that attaching the right visual vocabulary to a set of game mechanics was sufficient to produce something that felt complete and intentional from the first moment players encountered it. Sableye was introduced in the Generation 3 games as a dark and ghost-type Pokemon with a design that drew from the visual language of gemstones and creatures that lurk in dark, enclosed spaces. At the time of its introduction, the pairing of the dark type and the ghost type on a single Pokemon produced a creature with no weaknesses under the type chart that existed when Ruby and Sapphire were released. This was the stated design intention, a Pokemon created specifically to have zero type vulnerabilities, exploiting the particular interaction between two types that together canceled out each other's traditional weaknesses and neutralized the coverage of the types that would normally threaten them. The introduction of the Fairy type in Generation 6 changed this calculation, giving Sableye a new weakness and ending its status as the invulnerable ghost among the standard roster. But at the time of its creation, Sableye and the similarly constructed Spirit Omb represented deliberate design choices to create creatures that the normal offensive toolkit of the game could not effectively threaten. The philosophical decision to build a Pokemon around the concept of invulnerability is interesting in its own right. Most Pokemon designs begin with a visual concept or a creature inspiration and work outward from there toward a typing and a moveset. Sableye appears to have been designed in the opposite direction, beginning with a mechanical property and constructing a visual design that could carry it. The gemstone eyes, the shadowy body, the cave-dwelling associations, these are the aesthetic clothing of a mechanical concept, built to make the invulnerability feel natural rather than arbitrary. Absol is a Pokemon that has suffered from a specific and consistent misunderstanding throughout its existence in the franchise. Its dark type classification, its association with disaster, and the narrative conventions of its presence, appearing at locations where catastrophe is imminent, have led many players, and even some in-game characters, to conclude that Absol causes disasters. This is incorrect, and in the Pokédex entries for Absol across multiple games make the correction explicitly, though not loudly enough that it has fully resolved the misunderstanding in the public perception of the creature. Absol can sense the approach of natural disasters before they occur, a perceptual ability that appears to be passive rather than directed. It does not create the disasters it anticipates. It arrives near human settlements when it senses that disaster is approaching, not to witness destruction, but to warn. The warning usually goes unheard or is misread as an omen of doom, which reinforces the reputation rather than correcting it. Absol's attempts at communication are received as threats, and the creature has developed a cultural identity as a harbinger of disaster precisely because its attempts to prevent harm are consistently misinterpreted as evidence of malice. The creature's story, when understood fully, is one of the quieter tragedies embedded in the Pokémon world. The story of a being whose gifts and intentions are systematically misread by the people and communities it is trying to help. It is a design that carries emotional weight when the full context is assembled, the kind of weight that rewards players who read carefully rather than accepting the surface level reputation that the game's incidental dialogue reinforces. The move assist, available to certain cat-type Pokémon and a small number of other creatures, occupies an unusual position in the Pokémon move list because of the nature of its function. When used, assist does not produce a fixed and predictable effect. Instead, it randomly selects any move currently known by a Pokémon on the user's team other than the user itself and executes that move immediately. The user becomes a conduit for the collective move pool of the entire party, drawing from the available options at random to produce an effect that cannot be fully controlled in advance. In competitive contexts, assist has been the subject of complex strategy and occasional controversy because teams can be built around Pokémon knowing specific moves that the assist user can access, maximizing the probability that the random selection produces a desired outcome. The move has been banned from certain competitive formats precisely because the team construction strategies it enables can reduce the randomness of its execution to a level that the competitive community decided was inconsistent with the spirit of balanced play. Outside competitive contexts, assist is simply one of the stranger and more personality-rich moves in the game, a mechanic that makes the user feel like a member of a group rather than an isolated individual, dependent on and drawing from the contributions of the teammates around it. The move is a small mechanical model of cooperation, which is a quality that fits naturally within a franchise built around the relationships between people and the creatures they travel alongside. Mewtwo was designed with an explicit mandate. The brief given to the design team, as the Pokémon has been described in various accounts of the franchise's early development, was to create the most powerful Pokémon in existence. The creature that resulted from that mandate was intended to be the final challenge, the ultimate confrontation that would wait for players who had completed everything else the games had to offer. Mewtwo would sit at the end of all other challenges as the definitive test of how fully a player had prepared, how carefully they had assembled and trained their team across the hundreds of hours the games expected of them. Ken Sugimori's visual realization of this mandate produced a creature that has remained visually iconic across 4 decades, precisely because it manages to communicate power without relying on size alone. Mewtwo is large but not largest. It is imposing but not grotesque. Its design carries a quality of concentrated force rather than expansive bulk, which is a different and arguably more unsettling kind of power to encounter in a creative work. The most powerful Pokémon ever made does not look like the most powerful thing imaginable. It looks like something that was designed to be exactly as powerful as it needs to be, and not a degree more than that. The creature that received that design brief and that visual treatment became one of the two or three most culturally recognized Pokemon in the history of the franchise, which suggests that the mandate was fulfilled in a way that exceeded its own stated terms. Mewtwo was designed to be the most powerful Pokemon. It became one of the most enduring ones, which is a different kind of power and one that the design brief could not have anticipated. Arceus holds the distinction of having the most form variations of any single Pokemon in the franchise. Through the plates and Z crystals and type changing items that correspond to its design mythology, Arceus can adopt 18 different types, each of which constitutes an official alternate form. No other Pokemon in the history of the franchise reaches that number through the standard in-game mechanics available to it. The creature whose Pokédex entries describe it as the creator of the Pokémon world, the being that shaped existence through the act of its movement, is also the creature that most fully encompasses the type system that defines the mechanical identity of every creature in that world. The consistency between Arceus's narrative role and its mechanical design is one of the cleaner examples of thematic alignment in the franchise. A creature described as the origin of all things holds a mechanical position from which it can access all types. The type system that every other Pokemon navigates as a fixed identity is, for Arceus, a variable one. It moves through the categories that define other creatures without being fixed to any of them, which in the context of its mythology reads as an accurate mechanical translation of what a creator deity's relationship to its creation would logically be. The design decision that produced Arceus's formy system was functional as well as thematic, providing the franchise with a legendary Pokemon whose competitive and collecting utility could extend across a range of contexts rather than being limited by a fixed typing. But the alignment between function and narrative is close enough that the thematic reading feels as primary as the practical one, which is the mark of a design that was doing more than one thing simultaneously and doing both of them well. The franchise has always been willing to embed knowledge of the real world within the design of its creatures in ways that do not announce themselves. The 7 legendary birds and beasts of the early games carry connections to specific mythological and cultural traditions that reward the player who approaches them as subjects of research rather than simply as creatures to be caught and battled. The elemental forces they embody, the visual designs that express those forces, and the names that anchor them in the game's taxonomy all draw from traditions of natural mythology that span multiple cultures and historical periods. The connection that runs from Japanese folklore through the design of the legendary beasts, or from Norse cosmology through certain elements of the Sinnoh games, or from South American culture through the design of certain legendary creatures in later games, is one of the long threads that runs through the franchise's creative history without interruption. Each new generation has found new cultural traditions to draw from, new bodies of myth and natural history to translate into creature designs, and the result across more than 25 years is a roster of Pokémon that functions as an informal atlas of human mythological imagination. The world of Pokémon is not a self-contained fantasy. It is a curated collection of real-world inspirations assembled into something that feels internally consistent while remaining deeply connected to the cultural traditions that generated its parts. Every creature that carries that cultural connection carries it outward to the players who encounter it, creating moments of recognition for some players and moments of introduction to a tradition they might not have encountered otherwise. The educational weight of the franchise is not incidental. It is a structural feature of how the world was built. Magakarp's Japanese name, Koiking, carries within it a visual truth about the creature's design that the English name does not communicate as directly. Koi are a type of fish with a long history in Japanese and East Asian ornamental culture, prized for their color patterns and their association with perseverance and good fortune. The koi is a fish that people care about, that carries symbolic weight, that appears in art and garden design across centuries of cultural production. Koi King, as a name, claims that status while simultaneously presenting a creature that performs almost no useful function in battle and is widely regarded as the weakest Pokemon in existence. The name asserts royalty. The creature's performance does not. This is the joke and the tension that defines Magikarp's identity in the franchise. The enormous gap between what the name claims and what the creature actually does, which makes the eventual evolution into Gyarados feel like a payoff rather than a simple development. The koi that persevered long enough became something else entirely, which is exactly what the classical koi mythology says should happen. In East Asian tradition, a koi that swims upstream long enough and leaps through the Dragon Gate on the Yellow River transforms into a dragon. Magikarp becomes Gyarados. The mythology and the game design are telling the same story. The top fin of Magikarp, visible in its standard design, resembles a crown when examined closely, which reinforces the Koi King name with a visual detail that functions as a very small piece of evidence that the creature was always meant to be taken slightly more seriously than its combat performance would suggest. The relationship between the Detective Pikachu games and the broader Pokemon franchise extends into corners that most players who experienced the games through the films alone would not have encountered. Detective Pikachu Returns, the sequel to the original Detective Pikachu game, contains a piece of world building that adds a dimension under the human Pokemon relationship that most main series games leave implicit rather than explicit. In that game, it is confirmed that Pokemon give their trainers nicknames, operating a naming practice from their side of the relationship that mirrors the practice trainers engage in when they name their Pokemon. A Growlithe in the game refers to its trainer as a shortened version of that trainer's full name. Not the full name, not a generic designation, but a specific abbreviated form that communicates familiarity and affection within the compressed vocabulary available to a creature that expresses itself through a single repeated word. The detail is small, but it transforms the dynamic between trainer and Pokemon from a one-directional naming practice into something reciprocal. Both parties are naming the other. Both parties are shaping the relationship through language, each within the limitations of what their communication can accomplish. The idea that Pokemon give their trainers names changes nothing about the mechanical structure of the games, but it changes something about how the relationship between trainer and creature can be imagined. The creature that cannot speak the trainer's name in human language can still hold the trainer within a kind of linguistic recognition that is its own, using the tools available to it to do something that looks very much like what the trainer does when they name the creature that travels beside them. In Generation 2, the Pokerus virus, which functions in the games as a beneficial condition that doubles the effort values a Pokemon receives from battles and thus accelerates the process of competitive training, operates under a location-based restriction that was later removed in subsequent generations. In the Gold and Silver games, a Pokemon can only contract Pokerus if the player has already visited Goldenrod City at least once before the encounter, where the virus would theoretically be transmitted. Before that visit, the condition cannot spread regardless of the circumstances that would otherwise allow it. The implication of this restriction, that Goldenrod City is in some sense the origin point or the epicenter of the Pokerus in the context of those games, is one of the stranger pieces of game logic in the franchise's early history. The city is a bustling and populous location, the largest settlement in the Johto region, with extensive commercial activity and a constant flow of people and Pokemon passing through. If Pokerus is spreading from there, it is spreading from a place where the conditions for transmission are maximally present. Dense population, frequent contact, continuous movement of creatures through a single high traffic node. The restriction was removed in later games, and Pokeris became a universally available condition, independent of which locations the player had visited. But for those original games, Goldenrod City carries this additional identity as the point from which a beneficial viral condition spreads outward into the world, which adds one more unexpected layer to a city that was already doing a significant amount of narrative and structural work within the Johto experience. The Pokemon franchise has always existed in conversation with the broader landscape of Japanese popular culture, and that conversation runs in both directions. The games and anime have drawn from Japanese cultural traditions, folklore, and entertainment throughout their history, but they have also become reference points that other Japanese cultural products have drawn from in return. The mutual influence is visible in small moments distributed across a long history, and one of the clearest of these moments involves the original Pocket Monsters manga, the versions of the Pokemon story written and illustrated by Kosaku Anakubo that ran as a comedy alongside the other adaptations of the franchise. Characters from that manga, specifically Red and his Clefairy, made a cameo appearance in the main Pokemon anime, making them the first and only manga characters to have ever appeared in the anime series. The cameo confirms that within the logic of the Pokemon world, the anime and the Pocket Monsters manga occupy the same universe, or at least a close enough version of the same universe that characters can move between them without the encounter feeling impossible. It also confirms that Ash and Red, two protagonists of very different Pokemon stories, exist in a shared world rather than parallel ones. The cameo is brief and does not develop into an extended interaction. It is the kind of moment that rewards familiarity with both properties, offering something additional to the viewer who knows enough to recognize what they are seeing while remaining visually harmless to viewers who lack that context. The best crossover moments in connected media work this way, carrying a second layer of meaning for the informed viewer without withholding anything from the viewer encountering the moment for the first time. James, the member of Team Rocket, who travels alongside Jessie and Meowth through the extended run of the Pokemon anime, has a documented pattern in his relationship with the Pokemon he catches and trains. He has owned, across the series, 5 Pokemon that at one point or another have turned their physical attention toward him in ways that would charitably be described as aggressive or enthusiastic to the point of causing him harm. Victory Bell would bite him with its pitcher-like mouth, Cacnea would embrace him with its spike-covered body, Carnivine would gnaw on his head. Toxapex and Morpeko both continued this tradition in different episodes and arcs of the series. James's ability to form genuine bonds with Pokemon that are physically harmful to him in their expressions of affection is one of the recurring comedic elements of his characterization, but it also reveals something about how the anime conceptualizes attachment between trainer and Pokemon. The relationship is not always comfortable, it is not always free of pain, but the pain is not evidence of a failed relationship. Victreebel biting James is, in the logic of the anime, a form of recognition, the creature responding to his presence in the only way its design allows it to express what it feels about him. The 5 Pokemon who have treated James this way constitute, in their own strange way, a record of the relationships he has formed most completely. The creatures that hurt him are the ones that were most fully attached to him, and the attachment expressed itself through the particular physical vocabulary available to each creature's form. The pattern is played for comedy across the anime's long run, but it carries underneath the comedy something more genuine about the nature of how connection works when it crosses the boundary between species. Hariyama, the large sumo-inspired fighting type that serves as the final evolution of Makuhita, holds an unusual position relative to its pre-evolution in one specific mechanical category. The catch rate, the number that determines how easily a wild Pokemon can be caught with a standard Pokeball, is typically higher for pre-evolution Pokemon than for their evolved forms. The logic embedded in this design convention reflects the assumption that more developed and powerful creatures are harder to catch, that they resist capture more effectively, that they are in some sense less available to the trainer who encounters them. Hariyama has a higher catch rate than Makuhita, which inverts this convention without explanation. The evolved form is theoretically easier to catch than the pre-evolution, which runs counter to the intuition that evolution brings increased capability, including the capability to resist a Pokeball. Whether this reflects a specific design decision about Hariyama's temperament, about the sumo tradition the creature draws from, and what that tradition implies about an accomplished competitor's willingness to be engaged on equal terms, or whether it is simply an oversight in the data assignment process, is not clear from any available documentation. What is clear is that the number exists as an outlier in a system that otherwise follows a consistent directional convention, and the outlier draws attention to the convention precisely by breaking it. Most players do not examine catch rate data as part of their engagement with the franchise. The discrepancy between Hariyama and Makuhita is the kind of detail that exists as a quiet note for the players who do. Unused sprites, discovered in the data of Ruby and Sapphire, represent one of the more unusual connections between Pokémon and the broader history of Game Freak as a development studio. The sprites in question were designed for an overworld trainer type, a wrestler character that does not appear in the final versions of those games. When researchers tracing the visual design of the unused sprites followed the imagery to its source, they found that the design originated not within the Pokemon franchise itself, but in Mendel Palace, a game released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1990 that stands as one of the earliest titles ever produced by Game Freak. The connection between Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire and a game that predated Pokémon entirely by more than a decade, appearing as an unused sprite carried over or referenced from that earlier work, reveals something about how development studios maintain continuity with their own creative history. Visual language developed for one project can persist in a studio's collective design vocabulary long after the project that generated it has been set aside. The wrestler design from Mendel Palace lived in Game Freak's creative archive long enough to resurface in the data of a completely different franchise, appearing as a design choice for a trainer type that was ultimately cut before the game was finalized. The unused sprite represents a small piece of Game Freak's institutional memory, a visual artifact of a time before Pokémon existed, when the studio was building a different kind of game for a different kind of audience. Its presence in the Ruby and Sapphire data is the kind of detail that only becomes visible through careful archaeological examination of files that were never meant to be examined, but that reward examination with a genuine piece of creative history. Wobbuffet is a Pokemon that most players encounter as a recurring comedic presence in the Pokemon anime. A blue, upright creature that punctuates Team Rocket's speeches with an enthusiastic self-introduction that serves as both catchphrase and running joke. But beneath the comedy, there is a design with specific mechanical implications in the games that reward a closer examination of what Wobbuffet actually is. Its entire moveset is built around the concept of response rather than initiative. Every move available to it reacts to what an opponent does, rather than originating from Wobbuffet's own choices. Counter mirrors physical damage back at the attacker. Mirror Coat reflects special damage. Destiny Bond creates a shared fate with the next creature that defeats it. Encore extends the duration of an opponent's most recent move, locking them into repetition. The creature that plays an enthusiastic, straight-faced comedy role in the anime is, in the logic of the games, a purely reactive combatant. It cannot start a fight in any meaningful sense. It can only answer one. The design coherence between Wobbuffet's personality as a creature that always agrees, always confirms, always responds with affirmation, and Wobbuffet's mechanical identity as a creature that can only respond to what is directed at it is one of the more complete examples of thematic alignment between narrative characterization and gameplay systems in the franchise's history. The Pokemon that says yes to everything can only act when something is said to it first. The Japanese name Sonansu, meaning something close to that, is exactly right, or that is certainly so, deepens this alignment further. The name is a verbal affirmation, a creature that introduces itself with a statement of agreement, and a creature that can only fight by agreeing with the force directed at it and returning it amplified. Every layer of Wobbuffet's design is telling the same story, and that story rewards attention in a way that the surface comedy of the anime presentation never quite communicates on its own terms. Munchlax holds the distinction of being the first Pokemon from the fourth generation of games to be officially revealed to the public. This happened not through a trailer, not through a press release, and not through any conventional promotional channel. It happened through a film. Munchlax appeared in the seventh Pokemon movie, Destiny Deoxys, which was released in Japanese theaters in July of 2004. The main series games for Generation 4, Diamond and Pearl, would not release until more than 2 years after that theatrical debut. Munchlax existed in public awareness, had been seen by audiences in a cinema context, before the games that would formally introduce its generation were anywhere close to reaching the public. The decision to preview a new Pokemon through a theatrical film is one of the franchise's more distinctive promotional strategies, a way of building anticipation for a future game through a medium that operates on a completely different timeline and audience relationship. A film can carry a new creature and place it alongside familiar ones, allowing audiences to begin forming a relationship with the design before the game mechanics that define it have been announced or explained. Munchlax arrived in theaters as a personality before it arrived in players' parties as a creature, which shaped the initial reception of a Pokemon that has remained a fan favorite across the years since its formal introduction. The precedent that Munchlax established of using the films as an advance window into future generations was not entirely new, but the length of the gap between the film appearance and the game release made it particularly pronounced in this case. Players who saw Destiny Deoxys in the summer of 2004 knew they were looking at a future, not yet a present, and that anticipation carried for more than 2 years before the games arrived to fulfill it. The Pokemon world has always been built on the principle that ordinary objects, when filtered through the logic of the world's creative vocabulary, can become creatures with personalities, abilities, and emotional lives of their own. This principle has been applied to swords, to ice cream cones, to sets of keys, to chandeliers. But the earliest and most foundational applications of this principle involved objects drawn from Japanese cultural life rather than universal consumer goods. Baltoy, the spinning clay figure Pokemon introduced in the third generation, is one of the clearest examples of this approach applied to a very specific cultural object. The design draws from the Haniwa, ancient clay figures found in burial mounds throughout Japan dating back to the Kofun period, roughly the 3rd through 6th centuries of the Common Era. Haniwa were created in a wide variety of forms, some representing people, some representing animals, some representing objects, and they were placed around burial mounds in arrangements that scholars still debate the full meaning of. They are among the most recognizable artifacts of early Japanese culture, familiar enough to most Japanese people that a Pokemon design drawing from them would carry an immediate cultural resonance without requiring explanation. The spinning aspect of Baltoy's design connects to a different cultural reference, the spinning top as a traditional toy with a long history in Japanese play culture. The combination of an ancient clay burial artifact and a spinning toy produces a design that is simultaneously ancient and playful, solemn in its cultural reference, and light in its physical behavior. The tension between those two qualities is what gives Ball Toy its particular identity, a creature that carries the weight of the past while moving through the present with the light and perpetual rotation of something built for joy. There is a particular relationship between the Pokemon franchise and the concept of completeness that runs through almost every game in the series in a way that no other franchise quite replicates. The Pokédex, the device that records encounters with Pokémon and serves as both a catalog and a measure of the player's progress, transforms the act of playing into the act of collecting in a way that makes incompleteness feel like an active condition rather than a neutral default. The player who has not caught every Pokemon is not simply someone who has not caught every Pokemon. They are someone who is still becoming a complete trainer, still working toward a state of the game that is formally acknowledged by the franchise itself through diplomas, ribbons, and other in-game acknowledgments of full completion. This structure, where the game formally recognizes and rewards the achievement of completeness, is one of the franchise's deepest design commitments. It transforms what could be an open-ended collection activity into something that has a defined terminal point, a moment when the catalog is full and the game acknowledges that the player has done the thing the game was built to ask of them. The diploma given for completing the regional Pokédex in most games is a small moment that carries an outsized emotional weight precisely because the path to it is so long and the game has been building toward it for the entire duration of the player's experience. The completeness the franchise pursues is never actually complete, of course. Each new game expands the total number of Pokemon, pushing the terminal point further forward and transforming yesterday's completed Pokédex into tomorrow's partial one. The franchise makes this explicit, rather than hiding it, announcing new generations and new creatures as additions to a world that keeps growing, rather than as corrections to a world that was somehow unfinished. The incompleteness is structural, it is designed in, and the player who understands this and keeps playing anyway has arrived at the particular relationship with this world that the franchise seems to have always intended. Smeargle is a Pokemon introduced in the second generation of games whose mechanical identity is built around a single extraordinary move. Sketch, the only move Smeargle learns through leveling, permanently copies the last move used by the opponent in a battle, replacing Sketch itself with the copied move. This process can be repeated over and over through encounters with different Pokemon, theoretically allowing Smeargle to assemble any moveset that can be constructed from moves available in the game, with very limited exceptions. The result is a Pokemon whose personal move pool is, in theory, the entire move pool of the franchise. Sketch has 1 point of PP, meaning it can be used once before it needs to be restored, and each use replaces the Sketch slot permanently with whatever move was copied. The scarcity of the move, the fact that each use is a permanent commitment that cannot be undone without returning to a previous save, makes the act of building Smeargle's move set a deliberate and irreversible creative process rather than a casual one. The player is not browsing, they are deciding, and each decision forecloses the alternatives. The visual design of Smeargle reinforces the mechanical concept. It is a Pokemon with a paintbrush tail and marks on its body that suggest the residue of creative work, a creature that moves through the world, collecting impressions and expressing them through the medium it carries. The design and the mechanic tell the same story, a creature that does not own its moves in the way other Pokemon do, but instead collects them from encounters with the world, building a portfolio rather than a training regimen. It is among the most conceptually unified designs in the franchise, a Pokemon whose aesthetic, narrative, and mechanical identities are in complete alignment. The Pokemon trading card game has maintained a parallel universe of Pokemon lore alongside the main series games for nearly 3 decades. And within that parallel universe, there have been decisions about rarity and card hierarchy that occasionally diverge from the logic of the games in surprising ways. One of the most notable of these divergences appeared in the Pokemon trading card game for the Game Boy Color, a digital adaptation of the card game that was released in Japan in the late 1990s. In that game, the card hierarchy included a tier above legendary for cards that were designated as Phantom, a classification that indicated extreme rarity within the game's fictional card world. The four Phantom cards included Mew, Lugia, and then two choices that required a second look from anyone familiar with the games. Venusaur, the grass and poison type starter, final form from Kanto, was designated as a Phantom card, placing it in the same tier as Mew and Lugia. And the fourth Phantom card was not a Pokemon at all, but a trainer card called Here Comes Team Rocket, making it the only non Pokemon card to occupy the game's highest rarity tier. The message encoded in these designations, that Venusaur was in some formal sense rarer and more precious than legendary Pokemon, is the kind of thing that only a specific corner of the franchise's extended universe would ever assert, and it did so with complete sincerity. The Phantom designation in that particular game has not persisted as a broader franchise convention, and Venusaur has not generally been treated in subsequent media as occupying the same tier of significance as Mew or Lugia. But for anyone who played that particular Game Boy Color title, the knowledge sits quietly in memory as confirmation that this franchise has always been willing, in some specific context or another, to make unexpected declarations about the relative importance of the creatures within it. The move Ancient Power carries within its mechanical design one of the most visually satisfying outcomes available in the Pokemon game systems, though it arrives rarely enough that many players have fought hundreds of battles without ever witnessing it. When a Pokemon uses Ancient Power, there is a small probability that all 5 of the user's base stats are raised by one stage simultaneously, producing a sweep of improvement across attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed in a single moment. Most moves that raise stats do so selectively, improving one or two categories, requiring the player to choose which aspect of their Pokemon's performance they want to enhance. Ancient Power offers everything at once, briefly making the user more powerful in every measurable dimension simultaneously. The probability attached to this outcome is low enough that it cannot be relied upon strategically in most competitive contexts, and the move itself deals modest damage by the standards of the tiers where it might be used. But the rare activation of the full stat boost produces a moment that carries a particular quality of surprise and satisfaction, the feeling of having been given something unexpected by a game system that usually parcels its rewards more precisely. The all stats boost from Ancient Power is one of those outcomes that the game offers without ever quite promising, a possibility held in reserve that arrives as a gift when it arrives at all. The move's name also carries something worth attending to. Ancient Power is not just a power that is old, it is a power that belongs to an earlier time in the world's history, an expression of geological and elemental forces that predate the current form of the creatures that use it. The stat boost, when it comes, reads in this context as a moment when the deeper nature of a Pokemon briefly asserts itself, when the ancient inheritance encoded in its design momentarily overrides the ordinary constraints that govern its performance in battle. Jesse's Wobbuffet carries a detail on its design that most viewers of the anime have noticed without necessarily connecting it to any specific meaning. The tail of Jesse's Wobbuffet has a lipstick mark on it, a small impression in a warm red color that sits on the end of the tail in a position that distinguishes this particular Wobbuffet from any generic member of the species. The mark is present consistently across Wobbuffet's appearances in the anime, which means it is not a coloring accident or a production variation, but a deliberate character detail, something placed there and maintained across a long run of animation work. The mark is generally understood as a trace of Wobbuffet's relationship with Jessie, an impression left by contact with a trainer who wears lipstick and whose physical presence has, over time, been marked on the creature she travels with. It is a small and quiet form of characterization, the kind that accumulates meaning through repetition rather than through any single dramatic moment. Wobbuffet carries the trace of its trainer, not as a badge or an item, but as a physical impression on its own body, and the impression persists through every subsequent adventure without being called attention to or explained. The detail also says something about Jessie specifically, about a character whose relationship with Pokémon is sometimes reduced to the comedy of her ambitions and setbacks, but who is, at the level of the small, consistent details, someone whose presence still leaves marks on the creatures she cares about. The lipstick on Wobbuffet's tail is a very small monument to a relationships that the anime usually treats as a backdrop to other concerns, and it rewards the viewer who notices it with a moment of warmth that the surrounding comedy does not always provide. The Pokemon anime has run continuously since its premiere in April of 1997, which means that by any measure, it is one of the longest running animated series in the history of the medium. Within that run, certain Pokemon have appeared so consistently and across so many different contexts that their presence in the series has become something close to structural, part of the framework of the world rather than a character within it. Meowth, the Team Rocket companion who travels with Jessie and James across the entirety of the anime's original run and beyond, occupies this structural role in a way that distinguishes it from virtually every other character in the series. Meowth is a Pokemon that taught itself to walk upright and to speak human language. This is presented in the anime as an extraordinary and highly unusual development, the result of years of determined effort by a specific Meowth who wanted something badly enough to remake itself in pursuit of it. The backstory, revealed in one of the more quietly affecting episodes of the original series, presents Meowth's acquisition of speech as an act of sustained aspiration driven by the desire to impress a Meowth it was in love with, a Meowth who rejected it anyway when it had finally achieved the very thing it worked so hard to acquire. The tragedy embedded in Meowth's backstory, the sacrifice of the normal existence of a wild Pokemon in pursuit of a goal that ultimately did not achieve its intended purpose, gives the character a depth that the comedy of its ongoing scheming and scheming with Team Rocket partially obscures. Meowth is, beneath the comedy and the villainous context, a creature that spent years learning to be something other than what it was, and that carries the mixed consequences of that transformation forward into every episode that follows. There is a long tradition in Pokemon game design of encoding the specific geography and cultural character of a real-world region into the fictional region of each new game. Kanto draws from the Kanto region of Japan in ways that extend from broad strokes to specific visual details. Johto echoes the Kansai region's more traditional and historically dense character. Hoenn captures the maritime and island-scattered quality of Kyushu. Sinnoh reflects the northern geography and alpine character of Hokkaido. Unova translates New York City into a Pokemon world context with the density and the bridge-connected urban sprawl that defines that city's visual identity. Kalos draws extensively from France, and particularly from Paris, in ways that extend from the obvious Eiffel Tower reference at the center of its capital city to the more subtle influence of French artistic tradition on the designs of the Pokemon that inhabit it. Alola translates Hawaii into the Pokemon world's creative vocabulary, capturing the specific quality of an island archipelago with its own distinct ecological character and its complicated relationship with the mainland cultures that have influenced it. Galar maps onto Great Britain in ways that touch the countryside, the industrial history, and the cultural mythology of that island. Paldea echoes the Iberian Peninsula, with references to Spanish and Portuguese geography, architecture, and cultural tradition woven throughout its design. This consistent practice of grounding each new game in a real world geographical and cultural context is one of the franchise's most quietly educational features. Players who engage deeply with a Pokemon region and then research the real world place it was modeled on find a world that has been opened up rather than simplified, a place that rewards the curiosity the game generated without being able to fully satisfy it on its own. The Pokemon world and the real world are always in conversation, each informing the understanding of the other for the player attentive enough to follow the thread between them. The move sketch, which belongs to Smeargle, has one PP in its natural state. That single use matters because the mechanics of move PP restoration in the games are well established and widely understood. A player can use PP restoring items to bring sketch back after it has been used, which means a player with sufficient items and patience can technically use sketch more than once in a session. But the deeper constraint is not PP, but the permanence of the copy. Once sketch copies a move and becomes that move, there is no sketch left to restore. The slot has been filled. The blank page has received its impression. The implication of this permanence is that building a Smeargle's full move set requires specific planning and multiple encounters with specific Pokemon across potentially extended periods of gameplay. The player who wants a Smeargle with particular moves has to orchestrate those encounters, which means knowing what moves those Pokemon use, timing the sketch use correctly so that it copies the right move rather than a random one, and committing to the construction one permanent decision at a time. It is one of the most deliberate and involved customization processes available in the main series games, and the result is a Pokemon whose moveset is entirely the product of its trainer's specific intentions rather than a general template applied to any member of the species. No two Smeargle need be alike in their movesets, which places the species in a category of uniqueness that very few other Pokemon occupy. Most Pokemon share their level up moves with every other member of the same species. Smeargle's moveset is a record of the specific encounters its specific trainer chose to seek out, which gives it a biographical quality that the game's other Pokemon generally do not possess. The moveset is not just what the Pokemon knows. It is a history of where the trainer took it and what they asked it to learn. The Pokewalker accessory, released alongside Heart Gold and Soul Silver in 2009, was a pedometer device that players could carry with them through their daily lives, accumulating steps that converted into watts, a currency usable within the device to unlock special encounters and items. The concept behind the Pokewalker was to extend the Pokemon experience beyond the game system itself, bringing a small piece of the Pokemon world into the physical movement of everyday life. Players who walk to work or to school or simply around their neighborhoods could be accumulating progress toward in-game rewards with every step they took. The Pokewalker operated through infrared communication, transferring data to and from the Heart Gold and Soul Silver cartridges when brought close to the game system. A Pokemon could be transferred onto the Pokewalker and carried through daily life, earning experience through the steps accumulated and returning to the game having grown slightly from the journey. The device was not without its quirks and limitations, and many players found it as easy to shake as to carry, which somewhat undercut the fitness activity dimension of the design. But the intent behind it was genuine and thoughtful, a recognition that the experience of being a Pokemon trainer could have a physical dimension that the game system alone could not provide. The Starf Berry, among the rarest items in the franchise, could be obtained through the Pokewalker by accumulating 99.999 million steps, a number that represents approximately 50,000 kilometers of walking, and that no human being walking at a normal pace would reach within their natural lifetime without substantial mechanical assistance. The requirement exists as a statement rather than as a realistic acquisition path, a number so large that it transforms the item from a reward into something closer to a philosophical object, an acknowledgement that the rarest things exist at the edge of what is possible rather than within the range of what is achievable through ordinary means. Lucario, the steel and fighting type Pokemon introduced in Diamond and Pearl, has occupied a place in the franchise's public awareness that far exceeds what its game mechanics alone would justify. It has been a consistent presence in crossover games, in films, in promotional materials, and in competitive discussions across multiple generations of gameplay, maintaining a visibility that marks it as one of the franchise's most culturally significant designs regardless of the game era. The reason for this visibility traces partly to an intention that did not survive into the final design of the fourth generation games. Lucario was, in early development of Diamond and Pearl, considered as a potential starter Pokemon. The starter position in any Pokemon game is the most prominent and relationship-defining role available to any design, the creature that players receive before any other, that they name and carry from the very first moment of the journey, that becomes the central companion of their experience in ways that no subsequent catch quite replicates. A starter carries cultural weight that other Pokemon, regardless of their design quality, rarely acquire to the same degree. Lucario did not become a starter. The decision was made to assign it a different role in the game's structure, appearing at a specific point in the story as a companion to a mentor character whose relationship with it forms one of the more emotionally developed human Pokemon bonds in the main series games. But the consideration of it as a starter, which shaped how the design was developed and refined, left visible traces in how fully realized the character feels even in its non-starter role. Lucario's cultural prominence reflects, among other things, a design that was developed to starter-level completeness and then placed in a different position. The Shadow Pokemon concept, introduced in the GameCube title Pokémon Colosseum, released in 2003 in Japan, represents one of the more significant expansions of the franchise's lore in a game that most players of the main series never encountered. Shadow Pokemon are creatures that have had their hearts artificially closed through a process developed by the antagonist organization of the game, leaving them in a state of pure aggression with no capacity for the kind of bonding that normally defines the trainer-Pokemon relationship. The process of capturing and purifying Shadow Pokemon, opening their hearts through battle and care and affection, provides the central gameplay arc of Colosseum. The concept introduces an ethical dimension to the Pokemon world that the main series rarely addresses directly. The question of what happens to Pokemon that have been deliberately harmed, manipulated, or denied the conditions that would allow them to thrive. The Colosseum games do not shy away from this question. They make it the premise. The player is not simply a trainer catching Pokemon and building a team for competitive development. They are a former member of the organization responsible for the harm, working to repair what their previous affiliations helped create, returning to Pokemon something that was taken from them by human intervention. The emotional weight of this premise, of care as a form of remediation for a specific kind of harm, gives the Colosseum games a tonal depth that the main series games of that era did not pursue as directly. The Shadow Pokemon are not just battle-ready opponents. They are creatures in a state of distress, and the game frames them that way consistently, asking the player to respond to that distress not through combat alone, but through the sustained attention and connection that purification requires. It is one of the more thoughtful expansions of the franchise's core concept that has appeared in any form across its long history. Slowking, the evolved form of slowpoke achieved through trading while holding a king's rock, has a relationship to its evolutionary counterpart Slowbro that reveals something interesting about how the franchise conceptualizes the paths available to a single creature's development. Both Slowbro and Slowking are evolved forms of the same base Pokémon. They occupy the same slot in the evolutionary logic of the species, but their designs tell different stories about what happened during the evolutionary process, and those different stories produce different mechanical and narrative identities, despite the shared origin. Slowbro is defined by the shelter on its tail, a creature that bit into it and became permanently attached, introducing a parasitic relationship that the game frames as beneficial despite the obvious one-sidedness of the arrangement. The shelter delivers toxins that paradoxically heighten Slowbro's intelligence while remaining attached to a creature that cannot move independently. Slowking, by contrast, is defined by the shelter on its head, placed where it can deliver a different kind of influence, generating the distinctive cap-like crown and introducing a different set of Pokédex described effects on the host's cognition and demeanor. The same species of parasitic shelter in different positions on the same base, Pokemon produces entirely different outcomes in terms of personality, design, and mechanical function. This detail is one of the cleaner examples of how the franchise uses the mechanics of evolution to tell stories about the way external influences shape the identity of the creatures they attach to. The position of the shelter determines the nature of the change, and the nature of the change determines the kind of Pokemon that emerges from it. Small positional differences can produce very different beings, which is an observation the games offer without making it explicit. The concept of regional variance, formally introduced in Generation 7 with the Alolan forms of various Kanto Pokemon, gave the franchise a mechanism for exploring how the same species might develop differently under different environmental pressures and cultural conditions. An Alolan Vulpix is Ice-type rather than Fire-type because it evolved on a mountain so cold that its ancestral fire-based abilities were redirected toward thermal regulation rather than offense. An Alolan Raichu is Psychic-type in addition to Electric-type because the Pokémon absorbed the psychic energy present in Alola's environment and its diet through the taro pancakes is endemic to the region's cuisine. The regional variant system formalized a concept that the franchise had been suggesting in smaller ways for years, through the different encounters available in different routes, through the different Pokemon populations of different regions, through the Pokédex entries that mentioned habitat-based variations in appearance and behavior without making those variations mechanically distinct. Alolan forms made the suggestion explicit, turning what had been a flavor note into a game mechanic and opening up a creative space that subsequent generations have continued to explore through Galarian forms, Hisuian forms, and Paldean forms. Each regional variant is an argument about environmental determinism, a small case study in how the conditions of a place shape the creatures that develop within it. The fire-type Pokemon that becomes ice-type when it moves to a sufficiently cold environment is not a different species. It is the same species under different conditions, and the difference those conditions produce is categorical rather than merely cosmetic. The franchise uses this logic to enrich the ecological imagination of the world, to suggest that the same creature existing in different places could be fundamentally different while remaining fundamentally the same. The long-running mystery of Ditto's relationship to Mew has been one of the franchise's most persistent fan theories, and one that the games have never fully confirmed or definitively denied. The basis of the theory rests on several observable facts. Both Pokemon share a number of unusual mechanical properties. Both can transform, Mew through the move Transform, and Ditto through its identity as the Transform Pokemon. Both have a move pool consisting of a single move in their natural state. Both share a base stat total that is identical. And Ditto is the only non legendary Pokemon capable of breeding with virtually any other Pokemon, including Pokemon in the undiscovered egg group, a mechanical flexibility that suggests something unusual about its genetic structure. The theory holds that Ditto may be a failed or incomplete clone of Mew, a product of the same cloning experiments that produced Mewtwo, but one that did not achieve the stable form and power of that legendary. The purple-pink coloration shared between Ditto and the standard form of Mew, the mechanical similarities in their design, and the proximity of their original habitat in the main series games have all been cited as supporting evidence. The games have never confirmed this reading, and the designers have declined to provide a definitive statement on the matter when asked. The silence is its own kind of answer, or rather, its own kind of invitation. A franchise that has been willing to confirm many aspects of its internal lore through official statements, through Pokédex entries, through developer interviews, has chosen to leave this specific question open. The openness is likely deliberate, a decision to preserve a mystery that generates ongoing engagement and speculation without requiring the creative team to commit to a position that would foreclose further exploration. The unanswered question is a feature rather than an oversight, a space left deliberately blank in a world that is otherwise quite willing to fill in its own gaps. EV holds a position in the franchise's design history that has never been replicated by any other Pokemon, despite various attempts by later generations to produce creatures with comparable evolutionary flexibility. It is the only Pokemon with more than 3 branching evolution options from a single base form, and the number of those options has grown with each new generation, rather than being fixed at the point of EV's original introduction. Starting with 3 evolutions in the first generation, then expanding to 5 in the second, then adding 2 more in the fourth, and adding 1 more in the sixth, EV's evolutionary tree has grown across the franchise's history in a way that mirrors the franchise's own expansion. Each evolution corresponds to a different elemental type, and each has a different evolutionary trigger, creating a system that rewards both broad knowledge of the game's mechanics and careful management of specific conditions. Vaporeon requires a Water Stone, Jolteon requires a Thunderstone, Flareon requires a Firestone, Espeon requires high friendship during daytime, Umbreon requires high friendship during nighttime. Leafeon, in most games, requires proximity to a specific mossy rock or use of a leaf stone. Glaceon requires proximity to an icy rock or use of an ice stone. Sylveon requires high affection paired with a fairy-type move. The variety of evolutionary mechanisms built into the evolution system is itself a kind of tutorial in the different ways Pokemon can evolve, a single design that demonstrates through its own branching possibilities the full range of conditions that the franchise uses to govern development. Eevee is not just a versatile Pokemon, it is a demonstration of what the game's evolution mechanics are capable of, compressed into a single creature whose simple and appealing visual design gives no indication of the mechanical complexity it carries within its design framework. The move Destiny Bond, available to several ghost-type Pokemon, operates on a principle of reciprocal consequence that has no direct equivalent in most other competitive game systems. When a Pokemon uses Destiny Bond, it creates a condition that persists until the user's next action. If the user is defeated before its next turn, the Pokemon that dealt the finishing blow is also immediately defeated, regardless of its remaining health, its type resistances, or any protective effects it might have active. The move makes defeat consequential for the opponent as well, transforming the user's elimination from a simple loss into a mutual removal. The strategic implications of Destiny Bond are significant in competitive contexts. A weakened Pokemon that would otherwise simply be eliminated can, by using Destiny Bond, force the opponent to make a choice, deal the finishing blow and lose their own Pokemon, or hold back and allow the weakened target to remain on the field. Neither option is clearly preferable in all circumstances, which means Destiny Bond transforms a position of weakness into a position of leverage, a negotiation rather than a concession. The move's name carries a philosophical quality that fits naturally within the ghost type's thematic territory, the suggestion that death is not always a conclusion, and that connection between beings can persist even through the act of ending. The creature that uses Destiny Bond accepts its own defeat as the cost of ensuring that its opponent shares that defeat. It is a move built on the logic of mutual consequence, on the idea that some relationships cannot be dissolved by the simple act of one party ceasing to exist. In the context of a franchise built around the bonds between trainers and the creatures they carry, the move carries a thematic resonance that extends beyond its mechanical function. Pikachu's design has changed more times across the history of the franchise than most players realize, and the changes trace a specific directional movement that reflects evolving aesthetic sensibilities rather than random variation. The original Pikachu design, produced in the early 1990s for the first games, was shorter and rounder than the version most players are familiar with today. The proportions were closer to those of a squirrel than a mouse, with a rounder body, a thicker silhouette, and features that emphasized softness over the sleeker quality of later designs. Across successive games, trading card illustrations, anime seasons, and promotional materials, Pikachu gradually became thinner, more elongated, and more stylized, with the round body giving way to a leaner form that communicated speed and energy more directly than the earlier plump version. The transition happened so gradually that players who began with the earlier designs and moved through the franchise chronologically may have experienced the shift without registering it as a change. The Pikachu of the most recent games looks different from the Pikachu of the original games in ways that are visible once pointed out, but that most players would not identify from memory alone. The franchise acknowledged this design evolution directly in the Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee games, which used a sprite model that revisited the rounder proportions of the original design, treating the older aesthetic as something with its own nostalgic value rather than as a superseded version to be corrected. The choice to honor the original design in a game built around returning to the beginning suggests that the evolution of Pikachu's appearance is understood within the franchise as a history worth acknowledging, a visual timeline of a character that has changed in step with the changing aesthetic sensibilities of the people and times that have surrounded it. The concept of held items, introduced in the second generation of Pokémon games, transformed the strategic depth of Pokémon battles in ways that continue to influence competitive play across every subsequent generation. Before held items, a Pokémon in battle was defined entirely by its species, its level, and its moveset. Though introduction of items that could be attached to individual Pokémon and that would provide passive effects or conditional bonuses during battle added a layer of strategic customization that multiplied the number of meaningful decisions available to a trainer constructing a team. The berries that appeared alongside held items, many of which activate automatically when specific conditions are met during battle, introduced a form of passive strategy that operates without requiring any direct input from the player. A Pokemon holding a berry that activates at low health is making a strategic decision, in a sense, entirely without the player's intervention at the moment it matters. The player's contribution was made earlier in the choice to assign that berry to that Pokemon, and the activation of the berry during battle is the consequence of that earlier decision playing out according to the game's rules. This temporal displacement of strategic decision making, where the choices that matter happen before the battle rather than during it, is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of competitive Pokemon play. Preparation is strategy in a way that most game systems do not fully actualize. The trainer who prepares the best team, with the best items assigned for the right conditions, is not simply the one who reacts most skillfully in the moment. They are the one who imagined the most possibilities before the moment arrived and arranged their resources in anticipation of what the moment might require. There is a gentle irony in the way that Magikarp has been treated across the franchise's commercial and cultural life. The creature whose in-game utility is famously minimal, whose battle performance serves as the benchmark for powerlessness in the franchise's collective imagination, has become one of the most commercially successful and widely licensed designs in the entire Pokemon roster. Magikarp merchandise exists in enormous variety. The Magikarp Jump mobile game, which places the famously ineffective fish at the center of an entire gameplay experience, built around the single thing it can do in the main series games, was one of the most downloaded Pokemon mobile applications in its launch period. The commercial success of Magikarp is inseparable from the cultural meaning that has accumulated around its in-game uselessness. Players do not love Magikarp despite its weakness. They love it partly because of its weakness, because the gap between what Magikarp is and what it becomes through the act of patient training is one of the most satisfying narrative arcs available in any Pokemon experience. The Gyarados that emerges from a fully trained Magikarp carries the weight of all those levels grinded through on a creature that could barely fight back, and that weight makes the final form feel earned in a way that few evolutions in the franchise can replicate. Magikarp is the franchise's most complete argument for the value of patience, presented in the form of a fish that can only splash. Everything it will become is invisible in everything it currently is, and the game asks the player to hold that invisibility with enough conviction to commit to the training. The players who do are rewarded with one of the franchise's most powerful evolutionary forms. The players who don't give up on their Magikarp early, trading it away or releasing it for something more immediately useful, never know what they could have had. That structure is not accidental. It is designed, and it is designed to teach something that the franchise clearly considers worth teaching. As this journey continues through the quiet and accumulated knowledge of a world built with more care than it usually announces, it is worth taking a moment to consider what it means for a franchise to sustain genuine, creative curiosity across the length of time that Pokemon has sustained it. Most creative properties that have existed as long as Pokemon have become primarily administrative in their creativity, managing existing assets and meeting audience expectations rather than generating genuine surprises. Pokemon has not been entirely immune to this tendency, and there are games in its catalog that feel more like maintenance than exploration. But the franchise has also demonstrated, repeatedly and at unexpected intervals, a willingness to introduce genuinely new ideas into a world that has been visited by hundreds of millions of people and that might seem exhausted of novelty. Legends. Arceus changed the fundamental structure of how wild Pokemon are encountered and caught, abandoning the turn-based battle system that had defined every main series game since the first one in favor of a real-time approach that felt genuinely new while remaining recognizably part of the same world. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet introduced a fully open-world structure that removed the linear progression that had shaped the franchise's narrative architecture across decades. Each of these decisions carried risk, the risk that the changes would feel like a violation of what made the franchise recognizable, and each of them generated significant discussion among players who had different relationships to what the games had always been. The willingness to take those risks and to continue taking them rather than retreating to purely familiar territory is part of what keeps the franchise generating new facts worth discovering. Each new game adds new layers to the world, new details that will eventually be found by the players who look carefully enough, new connections between old ideas, and new ones that will only become visible when someone asks the right question. The world of Pokemon is still being built. The archive of quiet truths within it is still growing. And somewhere in the games released this year, or last year, or the year before that, there are details waiting to be found that nobody has found yet, sitting in the data the way Raiden's status as the first designed Pokemon sat in the history of the franchise, until someone thought to ask when it had begun. The relationship between Pokemon and food is one of the quieter threads running through the franchise's design history, present in enough designs and Pokédex entries and regional traditions that it constitutes a coherent theme rather than a collection of incidental details. Vanillite, Vanillish, and Vanillux are ice cream cone Pokemon, a design decision that provoked strong reactions when it was introduced in Generation 5, and that has since settled into its place in the roster as one of the more polarizing but persistent examples of the food as Pokemon aesthetic. Alchemy is a whipped cream Pokemon whose forms vary depending on the type of sweet topping it carries, producing one of the largest number of form variations of any non-legendary Pokemon in the franchise. But the food connection runs deeper than the most visually obvious examples. Many Pokemon designs that are not directly based on food have complex ecological relationships with specific foods that are described in their Pokédex entries, with specificity that suggests genuine attention to the biology of feeding and digestion. Snorlax requires an enormous quantity of food daily and spends the rest of its time sleeping, a design that models a very specific metabolic relationship with caloric intake. Munchlax, its pre-evolution, hides food in its fur and forgets it is there, a detail that is both charming and biologically specific. Tropius grows fruit on its neck as a result of having eaten so much of a specific fruit that the plant matter became integrated into its physical form. The food-based details in Pokemon design are doing several things simultaneously. They are making the creatures feel ecological, grounded in the kind of resource relationships that define real animal behavior. They are making the world feel inhabited in specific ways, suggesting that the regions have food cultures that predate the player's arrival, and that the creatures of each region are embedded in those cultures through the things they eat and the things they provide. And they are, in their quietest moments, making the world feel like a place where hunger and satisfaction are real, and where the relationship between a creature and what it eats says something meaningful about what the creature is. The soundtrack of the Pokemon games has been one of the most consistent creative achievements of the franchise across its long history, producing compositions that have accompanied hundreds of millions of players through their first journeys and their 100th ones with equal effectiveness. Junichi Masuda, who composed much of the early game music and whose creative contributions to the franchise extend far beyond composition into game direction and design philosophy, has described the approach to the game music as one of creating associations between specific musical themes and specific emotional states, building a library of musical cues that players would learn to associate with the feelings and situations they encountered alongside them. The result of this approach is a collection of compositions that function as emotional architecture for the games, shaping how players experience specific locations and encounters in ways that persist long after the gameplay itself has faded from memory. Most players who have spent significant time with any Pokemon game can hear the opening notes of that game's Route 1 music and feel something specific, something that belongs to the emotional register of beginning, of setting out, of the world being newly open and full of potential in the particular way it felt at the moment that music first played for them. Music in Pokemon does more than accompany the action. It defines it, provides the emotional context within which the action becomes meaningful rather than merely functional. The battles feel more urgent because the battle music accelerates the heart. The towns feel safe and welcoming because the town music is warm and unhurried. The legendary encounters feel genuinely momentous because the legendary encounter music is genuinely different from everything that came before it, providing a clear signal that the moment requires a different quality of attention. The music is not background. It is a primary storytelling tool carrying emotional weight that the visual elements in the dialogue and the mechanics alone could not sustain. There is a category of Pokemon lore that exists in the margins of the franchise's official output, in the Pokédex entries that describe behaviors so extreme or so unsettling that they seem to belong to a darker version of the world than the one presented by the game's cheerful interfaces and friendly town designs. Hypno's entries describe it using its pendulum to put people to sleep and then carrying them away, with some entries specifically mentioning children as the targets of this behavior. Drowsy's entries note that it can eat the dreams of people who have been asleep for a long time. Gengar's entries suggest that it was once human. Banette's entries describe a plush doll that became a Pokemon through the strength of its desire for revenge against the child who abandoned it. These entries exist in the same Pokédex as entries about Pikachu storing electricity in its cheek pouches and Snorlax requiring 400 pounds of food daily. The darkness and the lightness coexist without contradiction in the franchise's lore because the world of Pokémon has always been willing to hold both simultaneously, to present a world that is genuinely welcoming and genuinely unsettling depending on which corner of it you examine. The darker entries are not accidents or oversights. They are part of the world's design, part of the acknowledgement that a world full of powerful creatures with their own motivations and histories would not be uniformly safe or comfortable if examined closely enough. The players who read carefully and follow the darker threads in the Pokédex are encountering a different but equally authentic version of the Pokemon world than the players who focus on the cheerful interfaces and the satisfying collection mechanics. Both versions are true. Both are supported by the material the franchise provides. The world contains both, and part of what makes it feel genuinely world-like rather than theme park-like is precisely this willingness to place darkness and light in proximity without resolving the tension between them into something simpler than it actually is. The Pokemon franchise has a long history of partnerships with real-world organizations and institutions that have occasionally produced documentation and acknowledgments that carry a kind of official weight unusual for a fictional property. The franchise's engagement with the United Nations Environment Program, which has involved Pokemon Go events tied to real-world environmental conservation goals, is one example of the franchise operating at the boundary between its own internal world and the environmental concerns of the real one. The franchise's design vocabulary, with its emphasis on the natural world and the relationships between humans and the creatures that inhabit it, has always carried an implicit environmental sensibility. Many Pokemon designs are direct expressions of concern about specific environmental conditions or the creatures affected by them. Corsola's various forms, across different generations, track a trajectory that resembles the actual trajectory of coral reefs under the pressure of warming ocean temperatures, with earlier forms showing healthy coral coloration and later forms reflecting the bleached appearance of stressed or dying coral. The design choice to reflect real environmental change in the physical appearance of a Pokemon across generational releases is one of the more quietly impactful ways the franchise has engaged with the world outside itself, using the logic of regional variance to tell a story about environmental change that the games do not make explicit, but that the players attentive to both the Pokemon designs and the real-world conditions that inspired them will recognize. The relationship between the Pokemon world and the real natural world has always been more intimate than the fantasy setting might suggest. The creatures are inspired by real animals and real ecosystems. The threats in the Pokédex entries sometimes echo real threats faced by real species. The world building that produced each generation's regional design consistently draws from the specific ecological character of the real world places those regions are modeled on. The franchise is always, at some level, a conversation about the natural world it was created to celebrate. The first time a player completes the regional Pokédex in any main series game and receives the diploma acknowledging that completion, they are experiencing one of the franchise's most deliberately constructed emotional moments. The diploma is a small thing on its own terms, a brief text acknowledgement that appears on screen and can be stored in the player's bag alongside potions and repels. But the meaning it carries is proportional to the journey that preceded it, and that journey is long enough that the diploma's arrival feels genuinely significant in ways that brief text acknowledgments usually do not. The franchise understands this and designs the moment accordingly. The text of the diploma acknowledgement is warmer and more personal than most in game text. The professor who delivers it speaks to the player directly in a way that the game's ordinary interactions do not typically manage. The moment is designed to feel like a conclusion, which, in the context of a franchise where conclusion is always provisional and the next game's expanded Pokédex is always coming, is something of an achievement. The game produces a feeling of completion in a world that is structurally committed to incompleteness, which requires careful design to pull off without the completion feeling hollow. The players who have earned diplomas across multiple games have experienced the same constructed moment several times in different regions with different Pokémon and different professors and different designs, and each time the moment has worked because each time the journey to it has been real. The diploma does not create the feeling of completion. It acknowledges a completion the player already feels, arrived at through the hundreds of hours of searching and catching and trading and training that the game structured specifically to produce exactly this feeling when it finally ended. There are details in the Pokemon games that exist at such a level of specificity that they can only be found by players who approach the games as objects of systematic study rather than as entertainment to be experienced in the ordinary way. The encounter rate of specific Pokemon on specific routes at specific times of day, the precise probability calculations behind breeding mechanics, the exact numerical thresholds that trigger specific weather-based events, the specific chains of actions required to unlock hidden moves or areas or item sources. These details exist in the games as legitimate parts of the system, placed there by designers who knew they would only be found by a small percentage of the player base and who designed them specifically for that small percentage. The existence of this deeply buried layer of content is a form of respect for the most committed players, an acknowledgement that the game has more to offer than its surface suggests, and that the players who take it seriously enough to dig will find something genuinely worth finding at the bottom. It is also an expression of confidence, a willingness to put work into aspects of the game that most players will never encounter, on the assumption that the players who do encounter them will appreciate the effort that went into them enough to justify it. Game Freak has maintained this commitment to layered depth across every generation of the franchise, including generations where the overall design direction moved toward accessibility and broad appeal. The games have always had something to offer the casual player, and something different to offer the player who wants to go further, and the distance between the accessible surface and the deeply buried depth is wide enough that both types of engagement can coexist without either requiring the presence of the other. It is a design architecture that allows many different relationships with the same material, which is part of why a franchise now, more than a quarter century old, continues to generate new players and retain existing ones simultaneously. Marshadow, The mythical Pokémon introduced in Generation 7 carries a design and ability set that draws from the concept of shadow as both a physical phenomenon and a psychological one. Its signature ability, Spectral Thief, allows it to steal the stat boosts that an opponent has accumulated and use them for itself, absorbing the opponent's preparation and turning their investment in building an advantage into an advantage for Marshadow instead. The mechanic is built around the concept of something that exists in shadows taking on the properties of whatever it shadows, which connects the ability directly to the creature's visual identity as a being that lurks in the shadows cast by others. The connection between Marshadow's design and the specific competitive strategy embedded in its signature move is one of the cleaner examples in the franchise of a design and a mechanic that were developed together rather than arrived at independently and assigned to each other after the fact. The creature looks like what it does. The thing it does reflects what it looks like. The visual identity and the mechanical identity are not two separate design problems that were solved separately and then combined. They are the same design problem solved once, with both dimensions emerging from the same central concept. Marshadow also glows in different colors depending on its emotional state, shifting from its usual darker palette into a vivid luminescence when it enters the shadow of an opponent during battle. The visual drama of this color shift during the activation of its signature ability reinforces the connection between appearance and mechanics one more time, making the battle moment legible as an expression of the creature's nature rather than as an arbitrary visual effect. The design is complete, which is a word that can be applied to very few things in any creative field without qualification. The sheer number of Pokémon that now exist in the franchise, which passed 1,000 with the introduction of Generation 9, creates a categorization challenge that the franchise has addressed through a variety of systems across its history. The type chart, the egg group system, the shape categories visible in the Pokédex search function, the experience group classifications. All of these represent different attempts to impose organizational structure on a collection of creatures that is large enough that navigating it without structure would be practically impossible for most players. Each system reveals a different way of thinking about the relationships between creatures, a different set of criteria for what matters when grouping similar things together. The egg group system, in particular, produces groupings that can seem counterintuitive until the underlying logic is understood. Pokémon from very different visual and ecological categories are placed in the same egg group based on reproductive compatibility rather than visual similarity or shared type, which means that creatures that appear to have nothing in common can share a breeding category, while creatures that look nearly identical may be in completely different groups. The system reflects a biological logic about compatibility that operates independently of the design logic about appearance and type, creating a tension between different organizational frameworks that the franchise resolves not by eliminating the tension, but by maintaining both systems simultaneously and letting them do different work. The result is a world that can be organized in multiple different ways, none of which is wrong and none of which is complete. The type chart tells you one set of things about the relationships between Pokémon. The egg groups just tell you another set of things. The habitat data in the Pokédex tells you a third set. The competitive tier designations generated by the player community tell you a fourth set. Each of these organizational systems is a different question applied to the same collection of creatures, and the answers they generate are genuinely different and genuinely informative about the nature of what they are examining. As the quiet deepens, and these facts continue to settle into the particular kind of awareness that arrives when information is received slowly and without pressure, it is worth pausing one more time on the question of why any of this matters, why the hidden details of a franchise about catching and training fictional creatures have the particular quality of significance that they carry for the people who seek them out and hold them carefully. The answer may be something about attention itself, about the specific satisfaction that comes from noticing that the world you are inhabiting was built with more care than it required to function. A game could work perfectly well if Lapras were named something that meant nothing. A game could work perfectly well if Route 113's encounter pool were randomly distributed across the available Pokémon without the all S pattern. A game could work perfectly well if Pikachu's design had never changed, if Mewtwo had never been intended as the most powerful Pokémon ever made, if Smeargle's moveset had been fixed rather than constructed through the particular permanence of Sketch. None of these details were required, all of them were chosen. And the act of choosing them, of caring enough to build in details that most players would never find and that the games did not need in order to function, reflects a quality in the design team that rewards the attention it receives. When you find one of these details, you are not just learning a fact about a game. You are finding evidence that someone cared more than they were required to, and left that caring in a place where it could be found by someone who was paying attention. That is a form of connection across time between the person who made the choice and the person who found it, and it has the quality of real things rather than the quality of entertainment manufactured to please without engaging. The Pokemon world rewards the people who return to it, not because returning reveals new mechanics or new stories, though new games do provide those things, but because the world that was already there contains more than any single engagement could exhaust. A player who returns to a game played 10 years ago brings a different set of questions to it than they brought the first time, and those new questions will find answers in material that was always present, waiting for the right question to make it visible. The Pokédex entry that seemed like flavor text at 11 becomes a design decision worth thinking about at 25. The naming pattern that seemed like arbitrary decoration becomes a tradition with 60,000 possible applications once you understand what tradition it belongs to. This quality of the world continuing to yield to sustained and curious engagement is not accidental. It was built in, deliberately, by people who understood that the players they were making the games for would not always be the same players they were making them for at that moment. The games have always been made for the players who would come back, for the people who would ask the questions that go further than the games require, for the community that would keep examining the world long after any conventional measure of completion had been satisfied. Those players have been finding things for more than 25 years. They will keep finding things. The world is large enough and careful enough and built with enough generosity of detail that there is no particular reason to expect the supply of hidden things worth finding to run out anytime soon. The archive is deep, and the questions are many, and the people asking them are curious and patient and genuinely in love with the place they are exploring, which is exactly the right combination of qualities for finding the things that were left there for exactly that combination of qualities to find. As this journey through 99 facts about Pokemon draws toward its quiet conclusion, it is worth pausing for a moment on what these facts, taken together, reveal about the world they come from. They reveal a world built by people who cared about specific things, about etymology, about mythology, about the history of science, about the logic of competitive systems, about the way visual design communicates character, about the way language can carry meaning that does not announce itself. They reveal a world that has been built across a long time by many different people, each bringing their own specific knowledge and interest to a shared creative project, each leaving traces that a careful reader can find later. The world of Pokemon is not a simple world, though it presents itself simply enough that the complexity is easy to miss. Behind the cheerful colors and the familiar melodies and the friendly interfaces that invite any player at any age to find something worth doing, there is an elaborate architecture of intentional decisions. Every professor carries a tree name because someone decided early on that this was the tradition, and that decision has remained stable across decades of games produced by teams that have changed substantially since the tradition was established. Every shiny Pokemon traces back to an experiment shown at a convention in 1997 that most of the people who love shiny Pokemon have never heard of. Every Pokédex entry carries the possibility of containing something unexpected if you read it carefully enough. These facts do not change the experience of playing the games in any fundamental way. The games are still the games, regardless of whether the player knows that Raiden was the first Pokemon designed, or that Lapras carries a mathematician's name, or that Machoke is wearing a power limiter rather than a fashion accessory. But the facts add something to the experience of the world, a sense of depth and deliberateness that makes the place feel more real, more carefully made, more worthy of sustained attention and affection. The world of Pokemon has been generating these quiet discoveries for more than a quarter century, and it shows no particular sign of running out of them. Each new game adds new layers to an archive that is already vast, and each new layer contains its own set of details that will reward the players who look carefully enough to find them. The 99 facts gathered here are a beginning, not an end. They are the ones that surfaced during one particular journey through a world that is much larger than any single journey can cover. The most honest thing that can be said about the world of Pokemon after traveling through these facts and letting them settle is that it was built with love. Not just the love of profit or the love of entertainment or the love of franchise building, though those things are present too, but the love of specific things, of trees and mythology and competition and cultural history and the shapes that animals make and the names that mathematicians carry through centuries. That specific love is what makes the world worth returning to, and what makes the quiet facts within it worth knowing. There are places in every world that have been carefully built where something almost escapes notice entirely, where a design lingered just long enough to leave traces behind for the patient observer who was looking in the right direction at the right moment. The world of Pokemon carries these quiet shadows throughout its long history, details sketched and coded and placed without announcement, waiting for the questions that would eventually surface them. These are the hidden facts of a world that has always contained more than it needed to, built by people who understood that generosity in design, the willingness to include more than the minimum required, is what makes a world feel like a world worth staying in. And before we drift any further from this place, let these 99 facts rest where they have landed, not as information to be remembered and cited, but as small lights left on in rooms you might return to someday. The world of Pokemon will be there when you do. It always has been. It will still be full of things worth finding. If you found something gentle here tonight, there may be another quiet journey waiting somewhere close by. Let it find you when you're ready.